Good evening, everyone. I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to help you fall asleep. So before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the channel and like the video. I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching this, so leave it in the comments. When you're ready, get comfortable and relax. My name is Fernando, and for the past 10 years, I have been a ranger in an expanse of remote land that few know about. My job is not the most prestigious, but it has its advantages. The greatest of them all: solitude. This place has something special, something that grabs you. Rivers, forests, mountains, and people come here from time to time to enjoy it all. On weekends, especially in summer, it is common to see families and groups of friends coming to enjoy the cold water of the rivers and to get lost in the nature trails. I watch them from my lookout post, point out the routes, warn them about the dangers, but in general, my job is simple. I don't take part in the fun. My task is to make sure that everything is in order, that no one gets lost or hurt, that nature remains what it is, a place of calm and peace. But everything changed on July 28th, 2023. That day, the storm began much earlier than I expected. By mid-morning, the sky darkened rapidly, as if someone had suddenly turned off the light of day. First it was a few drops, then torrential rain, and as is often the case, the tourists began to leave. At first I wasn't too worried. I had already seen more intense storms. Most of the visitors left when the rain started to fall. Only the hardy ones remained, the ones who were not intimidated by the storm. They were a few, but at least they would not be in the way. Among them, there was a group of men who arrived shortly after the rain began. There were at least 5 of them, although I couldn't clearly see the exact number. They had arrived in an old van, which from the state it was in, looked like it had already been through many miles. From the beginning, something in their attitude caught my attention. They did not look like ordinary tourists. They were walking with a kind of purpose, as if their presence was not a coincidence, as if they were somehow there for more than just enjoying the rain. At first, I didn't think it was anything dangerous. People always came to the river in search of something, either tranquility or escape. But something about these men disturbed me. My instinct told me something wasn't right. I was at my lookout post, watching the storm come down and the few remaining tourists. The sound of the rain was deafening, and through the window of the station, I couldn't see much more than the shadows of the trees shaken by the wind. However, something made me look in the direction of the river. It wasn't a sound, not a movement, just a strange sensation that ran down my back. There, near the pool where the children used to bathe, I saw the group of men approaching a young man. He seemed to be alone. At first glance, I thought they were simply chatting, but something about the way they approached gave me a slight uneasy feeling. The young man had his back to them, sitting on a large rock near the water. He didn't look worried. In fact, he seemed as distracted as anyone on a rainy day. But the men weren't there to talk. One of them pushed him. First, it was a push that seemed casual, a rough joke, but then another joined in. They pushed him again, this time harder. The young man was unprepared, and his body staggered backward into the water. He tried to stand, but slipped and fell into the river with a loud thud. At the time, I didn't understand what was happening. I thought maybe it was one of those pranks that sometimes happen between friends. But then, something changed. The men didn't stop. Instead of helping the young man out of the water, they pushed him further. I watched as their bodies kept him submerged in the water. The young man was trying to free himself, struggling to breathe, but his movements were getting weaker and weaker. The scene was frightening. No one seemed to intervene. Only me, watching from a distance, helplessly. My head began to work quickly. I knew I had to do something. If I didn't intervene, the consequences could be fatal. I didn't understand why they were doing it, or what they wanted, but I knew I couldn't just stand by and watch. There was something about the way they were keeping him underwater that told me it wasn't just an accident. There was an intention behind it all, and that intent was dangerous. I ran toward the river, without a second thought. The rain lashed hard, making it difficult for me to see, but my legs kept going, driven by a fear that grew with each step. I had no plan. I just knew I had to make it in time. When I reached the edge of the river, I saw how the young man was already beginning to lose strength. He was practically underwater, but at least his hands were floating on the surface, like a mute cry for help. I rushed toward the group of men, shouting, though my voice could not overcome the roar of the storm. With all my strength, I pushed one of them. The man fell backwards, colliding with the slippery rocks. That gave me a small advantage. The young man managed to pull his head out of the water and coughed desperately, taking a breath of air. At that instant, everything seemed to slow down. The men realized that I had intervened, and that's when everything became even more terrifying. The group of men, now with fury in their eyes, turned to me. I knew it wouldn't be easy. I had managed to save the young man, but it was clear that they would not stop so easily. The face of one of them contorted into an expression of pure rage, and his body lunged toward me with unexpected violence. He was not big nor strong, but at that moment the hatred emanating from his being was enough to worry me. Another of the men came from behind. My body reacted instinctively. I hit the first one with a fist, but it wasn't enough. The man pushed me back. At that instant, my only priority was to escape with the young man. I couldn't stay there. I couldn't risk being overpowered. I grabbed the young man by the arm and, without further thought, ran into the forest, into the unknown. The chase was brutal. The storm was still raging, but what worried me most was not the weather, but the men following us. I could hear their screams, their heavy footsteps, and the sound of branches breaking under their weight. We had no time. We couldn't stop. We had to lose them. We ran without stopping, sliding through the mud, stumbling, falling, getting up. Each step was harder, but there was no choice. The young man, who at first could barely walk, began to adapt to the speed. I don't know if out of fear or out of sheer need to survive, but somehow he kept running alongside me. The forest, which had always seemed a familiar place to me, now became a maze. The trees seemed to move, the shadows lengthened, and everything was dark. The sound of the rain covered any other noise, making everything more confusing. At some point I stopped to listen, to try to understand if we were still being chased. But everything was silent. Just the sound of our breathing and the rain. The young man fell again. He was exhausted. I picked him up, but his legs could no longer go on. My own body was also at its limit. Yet something told me that we should not stay. We should not rest. The men were close, and if they found us, they knew we wouldn't stand a chance. We moved deeper into the forest. The darkness was total. I didn't know how long we had run, how long we had been losing our way. But I knew we couldn't go on any longer. Finally, we found a clearing. It was a small open area between the trees, dimly lit by the lightning coming through the clouds. The rain had stopped, but the air was still cold and damp. The young man collapsed to the ground, exhausted, and I fell beside him. We were both covered in mud, soaked and limp. Fear was still in the air, but there was nothing more we could do. We could only wait. Waiting in silence, not knowing if the men had reached us. During that long wait, not a word was uttered. Neither of us dared to speak. We stood there, on the edge of the abyss, not knowing if we had escaped, or if we were simply waiting for the inevitable end. At some point, the realization that this had all been a game, a macabre game in which we were the pieces, consumed me. We didn't know why or how we had gotten there, but somehow there was something bigger than us, something pushing us to run away, to keep running. I never heard from that young man again. I never understood why the men tried to kill him. I never knew what kind of game it was. But something inside me told me that sometimes some things are better left undiscovered. Fear does not go away, and the forest, like my soul, continues to keep its secrets. From that day on, I decided to abandon my position as a forest ranger. I did not return to that place, and although time passed, the echo of that storm still resonates in my memories. The feeling of being trapped in a macabre game, a game from which I could not escape, never left. The forest has its own secrets, and not all of them must be revealed. My name is Marcos, and what happened on the island that afternoon changed my life forever. Before that day, the island was just another tourist destination, a place away from the hustle and bustle where you could enjoy the sea breeze, the sound of the waves, and the peace of nature. However, since that encounter, walks along the coast are no longer the same. There is always something in the back of my mind, a nagging warning, a whisper of uncertainty that reminds me that not everything that seems innocent is really safe. It all started out as a normal day, or so I thought. My family and I had decided to spend a couple of days on a quiet island, away from the daily routine. The idea was simple: relax, enjoy nature, disconnect. And indeed, the first few days went perfectly. We were in a secluded place, surrounded by green mountains and an almost virgin coast, where the fresh wind seemed to envelop everything. People, although we were not the only visitors, did not crowd the place in an annoying way. There was a palpable peace in the air. Only the sea broke the monotony of the days, with its gentle murmur in the background. The afternoon I decided to get away was like any other. My family was enjoying the sun while I was looking for something more than the tranquility of the beach. I was feeling a bit restless, perhaps because of the same feeling of being trapped in a routine cycle. I walked aimlessly along the coast, looking for some corner where I could feel more connected to the island, further away from the hustle and bustle of others. The sea breeze was refreshing, and although the sky was covered by gray clouds, I didn't mind. The rain seemed distant still, just a faint foreboding in the air. Eventually, I found myself at the far end of the beach, where the trail began to enter the thick forest. The path, covered with wet leaves and roots protruding from the ground, seemed to invite me to explore it. My curiosity led me deeper into the forest, and soon I left the coast and the sounds of the sea behind. As I walked, the air became more humid, the sound of my footsteps absorbed by the foliage. Daylight faded through the treetops, creating a gloom that, instead of unsettling me, I found pleasant. The vegetation, dense and exuberant, seemed to protect me, as if it embraced me with its freshness. For a while, I walked in silence, only interrupted by the rustling of the branches under my feet. I had no clear destination. I just enjoyed the solitude of the moment, the peace that the forest offered me. But soon, something made my attention wander from my quiet surroundings. In the distance, through the trees, I saw two figures. I didn't recognize them immediately, but something about their position struck me as odd. One was that of a man somewhat taller than me, and the other, a woman, who seemed to move in a way that made me pause. The first impression was confusing. At first, it did not seem to me that they were doing anything out of the ordinary. However, as I observed them in more detail, I began to notice that there was something not quite right. The man was talking to the woman, and she, while maintaining apparent calm, was not moving freely. She seemed to be resisting something, as if she was trying to pull away or keep him from touching her. It was then that a shiver ran down my spine. I didn't know what was going on, but something about her movement seemed alarming. I decided to move closer. I didn't know if I was making the right decision, but my instinct told me I should do something. Maybe I thought that my presence alone might dissuade the man from continuing whatever it was he was doing. Maybe I thought it was all just a misinterpretation of what I was seeing, that it could be a misunderstanding. But, as I got closer, the details began to become clearer, and my assumption that something wasn't right became a certainty. The woman, who initially seemed merely uncomfortable, began to show clearer signs of discomfort. She took a step further away, but the man followed her closely, his movements more firm and authoritative. I watched as he raised his hand to her, but it wasn't until that moment that I realized the gravity of the situation. My heart began to pound harder. The man seemed to want to control her somehow, and from the woman's tense posture, it was clear that it was not voluntary. My breathing quickened, and in my mind the words, "I must do something," kept repeating themselves. Despite my nervousness, I did not back down. I moved forward steadily, but quietly, trying to approach without being noticed. My intention was simple. If my presence could make the man stop, If I could distract him for a moment, maybe the woman would have a chance to escape. But what happened next was much quicker than I could have imagined. The man saw me. His gaze changed in an instant, as if he had expected my intervention, as if he had wished for it. There was no surprise, no confusion, just a cold, calculating look. His body tensed, and a shiver ran down my spine when I saw the violence reflected in his expression. It was as if everything around him vanished, and his only focus was now to protect his control over the situation. The man took a step toward me without saying a word, but with a determination that made the air go thick. Before I could react, I felt a blow to my face. The force of his push sent me staggering backwards. I wasn't prepared for this, but my survival instinct was immediately awakened. I struggled to keep my balance, but the man didn't stop. He lunged toward me swiftly, pushing me again. My breathing quickened, and for a moment, I could think of nothing but how to escape this situation. I looked at the woman, expecting to see her run, but she did not. I was too far away, and she seemed paralyzed. Perhaps she didn't know if she should intervene, or if she feared something worse would happen. I watched as the man approached, but terror had paralyzed me. Every second seemed eternal. That's when I decided to run. I turned and began to run with all my power. My legs responded without thinking. My thoughts were cloudy. I just wanted to get away. The sound of the rain began to pound harder, and the slippery ground made my steps difficult. The forest no longer seemed like the welcoming place it had been minutes before. Every tree, every shadow, became a threat. Yet I didn't stop. My muscles burned, my heart pounded, but the thought of being away from that threat pushed me forward. Finally, I reached the beach. My breathing was ragged, and my legs were shaking with exhaustion. I looked around, searching for something to reassure me, something familiar. I saw in the distance some tourists still walking along the shore. I ran towards them, shouting to call the authorities. My mind, clouded by panic, focused only on that urgent need for someone to take control of the situation. When the authorities arrived, things took an even stranger turn. The search was exhaustive, but they found nothing. There were no traces of either the man or the woman. The place where the altercation had taken place was empty, as if it had never happened. The police questioned me, but found nothing to confirm what I had seen. No one else had witnessed what had happened. The woman, the one who had been in danger, disappeared without a trace, and the man who had been with her never showed up. The feeling of emptiness haunted me. No one seemed to know anything, and fear became a constant in my thoughts. The mystery was not solved. The island returned to its surface tranquility, but I could no longer see it in the same way. Every time I walked along the beach or wandered into the forest, I felt the presence of something I didn't fully understand, and although I tried to rationalize it, a feeling of distrust and dread came over me. My life was no longer the same after that afternoon. I learned that you can't always trust what seems safe, that evil doesn't always come with obvious warnings. In the stillness of nature, danger can lurk, waiting for you to let your guard down. Today, when I look out to sea, I no longer see only the horizon. I see a place full of shadows that only the most attentive eyes can see. And I wonder, who are really the people we cross our path? What stories do the shadows of the forests we visit without thinking hide? And above all, what will be left when we cannot distinguish between what is real and what is in our mind? What happened to me on the island is just a reminder that, on many occasions, the real threat lies not in what is visible, but in what is hidden. Human beings have an unfathomable ability to hide their intentions, and the consequences of not being prepared to recognize danger can be far more serious than we imagine. The island, which once seemed like a refuge to me, is now a place of warning, a reminder that not everything that seems harmless is, and that sometimes the darkest shadows lurk in broad daylight. I am Oscar, an agricultural engineer by profession. For years I have dedicated myself to raising pigs for food, an activity that, although not exactly glamorous, has allowed me to lead a quiet life and establish myself as a businessman within my community. Despite the difficulties that may arise, I have always found ways to solve problems. Country life has its own rhythm, and although competition is fierce, I had learned to hold my ground. My business grew, both in size and importance. Pigs had always been my passion, and until that day, nothing had prepared me for what was to come. It started slowly, almost imperceptibly. I began to notice that the numbers were not adding up, that there were fewer and fewer pigs. At first I thought it might be my mistake, a simple confusion. Suddenly, as I checked the stock, I noticed that one or two animals were disappearing for no apparent reason. I became concerned, but chalked it up to a natural loss, a couple of pigs that might have escaped or perhaps died without my noticing. The field has that unpredictable nature, and you learn not to be alarmed by every little thing. But over time, the losses mounted. I started with a couple of pigs down, then it was 3, and soon I realized that more than a dozen were missing. I tried to look for answers on my own but came up empty. The fences were intact, the gates were locked, and the roads inside the property showed no animal tracks or signs of any theft. It was as if the pigs vanished into thin air, and the truth is, I began to doubt my mental health. Was it me that wasn't being observant enough? Or was there something darker at play? But Cinco de Mayo was different. I decided I was no longer going to wait for passive answers. The growing concern over the animal's disappearance had left me with few options. I steeled my patience, grabbed my flashlight, and during a stormy night, stood in a dark corner of the grounds, hidden among the trees. The rain was coming down hard, and thunder rumbled across the field, as if nature itself was warning me of what was to come. The storm was strong, but it was precisely that storm that would give me the opportunity to discover what was happening on my land. The sound of the rain was almost deafening, and the darkness was almost absolute. Only my flashlight cut through the fog, and the lightning briefly illuminated the terrain. Everything was covered by water, and mud stuck to my boots as I slipped silently through the bushes. The hope of discovering what was really going on kept me awake, alert, despite the heaviness of the weather. My eyes kept fixed on the only visible space, a small clearing where the pigs used to be. There, in the middle of the storm, I saw something that would change everything. A pair of figures moved through the shadows, dragging something behind them. At first, I thought they were other animals, maybe some wild dog, but I soon realized they were not. Those figures were human. At first I froze, not knowing if I should act or if I was seeing something I shouldn't be seeing. I couldn't understand what was happening, but what I saw froze me. The men were apparently carrying bags or sacks filled with what appeared to be pig parts, animals that were no longer whole. There was no doubt they were stealing my pigs, but what made me feel a knot in my stomach was seeing how they handled them, how they treated them as if they were disposable objects. The missing pigs were no longer alive. Some were clearly dead, others probably brutally injured. At that moment, I understood that I was not just losing animals. I was losing something more important: my control, my peace. These men were not only stealing, they were destroying everything I had built. In that instant, my reaction was impulsive, instinctive. I rose from my hiding place, ready to confront these thieves. I knew I could not let this happen. I knew I could not allow my business to be destroyed in this way. I moved forward, my heart pounding and my nerves on edge. The rain was coming down harder, soaking me to the bone, but I didn't feel cold. I felt only fury. I got close enough to be near them, but unseen, and it was at that moment that one of the men suddenly turned around. I don't know how the others reacted, but what happened next was total chaos. The man who saw me screamed, and before I could realize what was happening, one of the others came toward me. The rain and the storm didn't seem to matter to them. Their only goal was to get me out of the way. The struggle was swift and violent. I tried to defend myself, using the flashlight as a makeshift weapon, but the rain and mud hindered my movements. I felt myself being pushed to the ground, the mud covering me, the sound of the rain mixed with the muffled screams. Time seemed to slow down. In my mind, there was only one clear idea: to survive. I felt the weight of other people's hands on me. I felt the desperation of being in a fight I didn't know if I was going to win. In the middle of the struggle, one of the men tried to block my way, while the other one was in charge of holding me with more force. I realized that if I did not manage to free myself soon, I would not get out of there alive. It was a matter of life or death. I could not let them catch me. The mud made it difficult for me to see, and the rain seemed to fall harder. At that moment, adrenaline allowed me to do something that even I didn't think was possible. I managed to break free, turn around and run. Fear, sheer terror, pushed me to keep going, without looking back. I ran as fast as I could. I didn't know where I was going. I just wanted to get away from them, from that danger. My lungs were burning. My mind was only thinking about getting to the safety of the house. The storm was pushing me forward, and every step I took seemed like my life was hanging by a thread. When I finally reached the safety of the house, fear had left me speechless. I dropped to the ground, soaking wet, exhausted. The sound of the storm was still roaring, as if nature itself was trying to drown out my thoughts. I couldn't process what had just happened. I couldn't understand how I had come so far, how I had come so close to losing everything in one night. The police arrived soon after, as did my neighbors. I told them what had happened, but I couldn't give them too many details. Even though they promised to investigate, I couldn't help but feel that there was something much bigger behind it all. The men were never found. No one knows if they were just common thieves or something more sinister. No one saw their faces. No one could give a clear description. The uncertainty weighed on me, but something inside me told me that this was not the last I would hear of them. What I learned that night is something I will never forget. It's not just about protecting what's yours. It's about being prepared for the unexpected, for the unknown. Since that day, I am no longer the same. I've installed stronger fences, tighter security measures, and I treat my animals with more care. But what has changed the most is my perspective. I am no longer the man who thinks he is invulnerable, who thinks he will always come out unscathed. Life can change in a second, and if you're not prepared, you can lose everything. The storm passed, but its echo remains in my mind. What I saw that night, what I experienced, made me understand that real danger is not always seen coming. Sometimes, it's a shadow hiding in the dark, waiting for you to let your guard down. What happened that night at my farm was not just a robbery. It was a lesson in the unseen dangers that lurk in the shadows. Life is not always as predictable as we think, and we can't always control what happens. Human beings have an infinite capacity for evil, and sometimes that evil lurks in the most unexpected corners. Tranquility can disappear in the blink of an eye, and when we are not prepared, the price we pay can be much higher than we imagine. The rain has begun to fall furiously, as if the sky was taking revenge for something. Thick drops hit the window panes, making the darkness even more oppressive, more impenetrable. I've been sitting in the corner of my apartment for hours, watching with a false calm through the crack, the silhouette of the man standing there in the corner. He is no mere passerby. I know that. I've been trained to recognize the threat, to anticipate what's coming. He is not casual. No one in their right mind stands for so long in one place under the storm, not moving, not even taking cover. No, he is watching, and he is watching me. The situation is clear, but no less dangerous for that. It has been 5 months since I settled in this country, after years of wandering, of hiding, of running away from my own life. For 25 years I worked for the agency, one of the most powerful intelligence organizations in the world. It was not a normal job, not a conventional job, not even close to what ordinary people could understand. My specialty was infiltration, concealment, making myself invisible, erasing my tracks. But everything changed when I discovered something I shouldn't have seen, something that even the agency itself didn't want to be known. And now, my name no longer exists in the official records. I am marked, and my former colleagues, the same ones who were once my allies, are after me like a wounded animal. I have been in this country for 5 months now. 5 months in which I had thought I could finally rest. The quiet apartment in which I took refuge had become my fortress. But today, as I see that motionless figure on the street corner, I know that everything I had believed in is about to crumble. My breathing becomes heavy as I peer through the slit in the curtain. I'm used to this feeling, this pressure in my chest, but it is no less uncomfortable. Every muscle in my body is tense, every one of my senses alert. The rain is deafening, as if the whole world has collapsed on my shoulders, but I know I can't trust the sound of the storm. The noise of the rain can be the best disguise for the stealthiest of movements. The man is still there, standing there, watching my window, not moving. But I know he's not waiting for me to peek out. He already knows I've seen him. He's waiting for something, maybe just the right moment to take the next step. I don't know what he wants, but I know enough to understand that this is no mere coincidence. It's been more than 20 minutes since I first saw him. The clock strikes 3:23 a.m., and the tension in the air becomes almost unbearable. I feel as if my whole body is vibrating with the same energy as the storm, as if every drop of rain is a sign, a warning, a harbinger of what is to come. I know I can't stay here. It won't be long before my old companions realize that I have detected them. The fact that I am alone in this place does not give me any advantage. On the contrary, it only makes my position more vulnerable. In this job, learning how to get out of a situation like this is a skill you learn quickly, or else you don't survive. The problem is that the options I have are limited. The window in front of me is small, almost impossible to get through without making noise. The front door is locked, and somewhere, at a dangerous distance, there must be 2 other men waiting. I'm surrounded, I know, and I know I don't have much time. I have learned to read these moments, to listen between the lines of silence. There is no doubt they are close. There is no easy way out. One option, then, is to escape through the roof, but that means going into the darkness and trusting that they haven't set a trap for me. The buildings in this area are low, the streets narrow. My former companions have always been excellent at tracking, and that means that any move I make is being monitored, almost with frightening accuracy. I take a deep breath. I can't be paralyzed. Fear can be a warning sign, but it can also be a chain. My fingers brush against the small pocket knife I always keep in my pocket, a last resort in case all fails. But I know that death does not come in such a simple way. The enemy I'm dealing with is cunning, meticulous, capable of thinking one step ahead just like me. With no other choice, I decide to do the only thing I have left, take advantage of the storm. I rush into the dark hallway of my apartment, where I store my belongings. Quickly, I pack the essentials. What I can't leave behind is the envelope containing the information I discovered, information that could destroy the entire agency, everyone who was once my colleague. That information is my only bargaining chip, my only life insurance. As I hurry out of the apartment, the sound of footsteps on the ceiling grows louder and louder. The man in the corner is gone. That makes me think he has taken another step, that the hunt has officially begun. My body goes into automatic mode. It all comes down to a matter of survival. I climb onto the roof of the building. The rain lashes my face with an almost unbearable brutality. Through the curtain of water, I try to get a sense of my surroundings, but visibility is nil. I crawl to the edge of the roof, looking for some indication that there is another way out, another shelter, but all is dark. Only the rumbling of the storm accompanies me. The air is thick, and the wind almost knocks me to the ground, but I can't afford to fall. My life depends on not falling. At that moment, a figure appears in the shadows. It's a man, tall, thin, wearing a dark jacket. I recognize him instantly. One of them. The agency never forgets its best men. There is no time to hesitate. My training kicks in, and in one swift movement, I leap into the next building. I fall to my knees, and although the impact is painful, I get up quickly. I can't stay there. The shadow behind me grows. I know it's chasing me. I know there's no way to gain time. I run, feeling my legs burning under the effort, while the rain doesn't let up and the storm becomes more intense. I don't have a plan. I just know that I must keep going, into the unknown. Every second, every step, is a matter of life or death. The city becomes a labyrinth of streets, buildings, and shadows, and the only sound that accompanies me is the sound of my agitated breathing, the sound of the rain that doesn't stop falling, and the echo of those footsteps, always behind me. Suddenly, when I no longer know if I will be able to keep running, something changes in the air. The chase is no longer a simple hunt. There is something else, something I had not considered until now. They are waiting for me to give up. They are waiting for me to make a mistake. But the worst mistake is to underestimate them. My body is at its limit. I don't know if I have the strength to continue, but the truth is that I have no choice. If I stop, if I give up, they will kill me. And if I keep running, so will they. The difference is, if I keep running, I might have a chance to win. That's what we are in the end. Men who run, who escape, who fight, but who never stop being hunters, even if we no longer know what we're running from. The rain falls relentlessly, and I, not knowing where I'm going, run towards the abyss. And perhaps, in the end, the real fear is not being caught, but what one discovers about oneself when there is nowhere left to run. Life sometimes is not about winning or losing. Sometimes it's about running, even when you don't know if there's an end, or even if it's worth continuing. But as long as you're running, you still have the option of deciding at what point to stop running, although you may never know when it's too late. The rain beats against the window with fury. The storm drags with it the sound of every drop, as if the sky itself is breaking. It is night, but there is no calm in the darkness. There is something strange in the air, something pressing on my chest. The same thing I feel every time I notice someone's eyes following me, even if I don't see them. I am alone in the small house assigned to me, in a remote village. I have been living here for months now, under a false identity, under a threat that is unseen but felt. I am no one here. No family, no friends, no one who recognizes me, no one who understands me. I am a protected witness, and my only mission is to survive. But the weight of loneliness is heavier than any lie I've left behind. Memories of my former life fade little by little, dissolving into routine and constant anxiety. In my other life, I was an ordinary man, with a job, friends, a family that didn't deserve this fate. Everything changed the day I was in the wrong place, at the wrong time, and I saw something I shouldn't have seen. Something so dark that it undid everything around me. Something that swept away my life, my safety, and put everyone I cared about in danger. Funny how an instant can change everything. A phone call, a sound in the street, a shadow in the window. I didn't think about those things before. Before, I didn't think about what could happen if a simple conversation turned deadly. But now, after all I have seen, all I have lost, I am just another shadow in this town. A shadow that is always about to be seen. A shadow that cannot hide for long. Today, as the storm continues to rage outside, something unsettles me. Something is altered in the air. I can't pinpoint what it is, but I know something has changed. The wind hits the windows with such force that the walls seem to shake. But it's not the wind. It's the feeling. That feeling that runs down your back, that whispers to you that someone is nearby, watching you. I don't know if it's paranoia or if it's accumulated fear, but I can't help it. My mind starts working at full speed. It's not just that the storm has trapped me here. It's that I'm afraid of what might be happening outside, of what they might be doing. It's not the first time paranoia has taken hold of me, but this time I feel like it's not just a feeling. My phone rings. Just a flicker on the screen lets me know it's an unknown number. In my previous life, I would have answered without thinking. But now I know that every call is a threat. No one, absolutely no one can find me, and if they do, I'm finished. He didn't answer. He didn't even look at the screen any longer. But my heart beats faster. I stand up, pacing the small house with slow steps, as if the sound of my own feet might betray my presence. I look out the window. The noise of the rain is deafening, but the shadows seem to move out of my sight. There, at the edge of the street, something is not right. And it's not the storm that's getting on my nerves. It's the feeling that someone is watching my every move. I've noticed something strange for days now. Not many people have been coming to town, let alone this house. But for the last couple of weeks, something has changed. I've seen strange cars passing by on the street without stopping, watching me out of the corner of their eyes, as if they wanted to make sure I was here, like they're watching me. My fingers clench the phone in my pocket, my only contact with the outside world. The only channel I have to know if my pursuers are closer. But I can't do anything with it, nothing to help me escape. The wind keeps whipping at the windows, but the sound of a car driving away makes me stop in my tracks. I move closer to the window. My breathing stops as I stare out at the wet street. The headlights of a car disappear around the bend. I don't know if it's one of them, but my instinct tells me it is. The feeling doesn't leave me. Danger is near, very near. Since I was moved to this town, my days have been routine, monotonous, empty. I have learned not to trust anyone, not to talk to strangers, to stay as far away as possible from anything that could put me in danger. But there is one thing I have never been able to avoid: my fear. The fear that no matter how well I hide myself, there will always be someone looking for a way to find me. It's not that I haven't done everything I can to protect myself. I changed my name, my identity, my face, everything, even my story. But they are good. They're more than good. They are experts at tracking down people like me who once knew too much and decided to talk. I never wanted to be a witness to anything. But now I'm the last witness, and my pursuers are on an unstoppable hunt. What I fear most is not what might happen to me. No. What terrifies me most is what might happen to the people I'm still close to. It's not just that my life is in danger. It's that the lives of those who cross my path are too. They are not just looking for me. They are looking for me to silence what I know. And every day I spend here, unable to escape, I feel the shadows draw closer. There are days when I have felt like a trapped animal, waiting to be hunted. I move in the shadows, always watching, always on the defensive. On days when I feel most vulnerable, I know there is no easy solution. If I decide to flee, my pursuers will follow me to the end of the world. If I stay, the people I still care about will be in danger. The paradox of my existence is that as much as I try to protect myself, I am putting everyone around me in danger. The storm continues to roar, stronger than ever. The sound of the rain pounding on the windows is almost unbearable, but even more unbearable are the thoughts running through my mind. What should I do now? Should I continue to hide, at the cost of losing everything I have left? Or should I finally take the consequences of my actions and face them, even if it means death? It is strange how one can change in such a short time. Before, I was a quiet man, a man who just wanted to live a normal life. Now, I am someone who looks at the shadows with distrust, who listens to every step in the dark, expecting the worst. My friends, the few I still have, don't know the truth. They don't know what haunts me. And if they did, maybe they would stay away. Or maybe they would simply bid me a final farewell. The rain stops for a moment, and in that oppressive silence, I hear something I can't identify. A creak in the wood, a slight scrape on the door. Fear freezes me, but I can no longer stand still. I move quickly into the hallway, my body responding on instinct. My only option is to get out. Get out now, before they find me. Even though I don't know where to go. Even though I don't know if I have anywhere to go. All I know is that if I want to survive, I have to leave behind everything I've ever known. I have to leave behind my life, my memories, and perhaps the last people I still care about. The door slowly opens, and the shadows grow closer. But something inside me tells me there is no turning back. Everything I am, everything I have been, depends on this moment. Life is not only about what one chooses to do, but also about what one is willing to lose. In the end, survival is a cruel game in which decisions come at a cost. But there's something scarier than dying. Living knowing you've endangered everyone you ever cared about, and still keep running. You don't always know when life will change, or if it ever will. For me, that truth became apparent one night that seemed as ordinary as any other. We were returning home from a quiet dinner with my wife, Valeria, and my son, Thomas. We had had a good time, celebrating Valeria's birthday, laughing and enjoying one of those rare nights when everything seems to go right. Thomas, as usual, had been playing with his phone the whole way, while I drove, with the rain gently pattering on the windshield. It was a dark night, but not unusual. The city, though large, had never given me the feeling of being dangerous. We lived in a quiet neighborhood, far from the hustle and bustle, and thought we had everything under control. The streets lit by street lamps created a peaceful, almost cozy atmosphere, but the rain, which seemed a mere nuisance at first, soon became an omen, not of storm, but of something much darker. As we turned the corner and headed down our street, I noticed the car in front of us suddenly slow down, forcing me to slow down. A couple of seconds later, something strange happened. Two men, dressed in dark clothing and hoods, appeared out of nowhere. One of them, despite the rain, walked straight towards the car, and the other stood in the middle of the street, blocking the exit. I saw them appear so quickly that at first I didn't understand what was happening. I thought perhaps they were lost pedestrians or someone in need of help, but the expression on their faces quickly dispelled any hope that it was harmless. The pressure in my chest immediately increased. My mind began racing a mile a minute, but my body was unresponsive. For a moment, I was convinced it was all a bad joke, a false alarm. Maybe they needed something, an address or a phone number. But as soon as the man who approached the window raised a hand and held out a gun, I knew it was no joke. The rain was now falling with unbearable intensity, and the sound of the water crashing against the roof of the car was becoming increasingly deafening to me. The atmosphere became so tense that everything around me seemed to vanish. The man in front of me wordlessly ordered me to roll down the window. My pulse quickened, but I did it. My body moved almost by instinct, as if controlled by something outside of me. I didn't feel fear, or at least not in the way I imagined. It wasn't the dread of death that held me back. It was the terror of seeing what was coming, the certainty that this moment would mark a before and after in my life. The man said nothing, simply pointed his gun toward the passenger seat, where Valeria and Thomas were. The tension in the air was palpable, as if every second was getting longer and longer, while the seconds were turning into an eternity. My mind was trying to find a solution, but nothing seemed to make sense. All I knew was that I had to keep my family safe. I was ordered out of the car. Without another word, I was forced out, and the blow to my side was so quick I hardly felt it. The pain that accompanied it, however, was instantaneous. Fear of the unknown mingled with a sense of vulnerability. I didn't know if we would be killed or simply robbed. At that moment, all I cared about was that Valeria and Tomas were okay, that nothing happened to them. They pushed me to the side of the car, without letting us talk, without giving us a chance to reason. The second man, who until that moment had remained still, reached over to take the wheel. They both seemed to know exactly what they were doing, as if everything was planned. There was no hurry, but no hesitation either. There was something in their movements that showed absolute control over the situation. In their eyes there was not a hint of remorse, just a total coldness. Valeria and Thomas, on the other side of the car, were already being forced out. I saw the fear in my wife's eyes and in Tomas, who had gone silent as if in shock. Nothing I could say to them would alleviate that fear. They too were part of this terrible game, and there was nothing we could do. When the men started the car, my first impulse was to run toward them to try to stop them, but the gun in the hand of the man who had hit me made me stop. It was one of those decisions that you make without thinking about it, but they mark you forever. I knew that if I ran, my two loved ones would pay the price. The next thing I remember is the sound of the tires hitting the wet asphalt, and the figure of the car disappearing as the rain engulfed everything. There were no words, no screams, no promises, just a deep emptiness. The anguish that emptiness left me with was unlike anything I had ever experienced before. As the storm raged on, the fear began to take me over completely. We stood there, soaking wet, not knowing what to do, unable to react. The rain was still falling, but it was no longer the same rain. It was no longer a comforting sound. Now it was a nightmare that wouldn't stop. I can't remember how long we spent there. The human mind has a way of blocking out the unbearable, of denying reality when it is too hard to face. What I do know is that when we finally found help, it was too late. The car was miles away, and the hours of anguish, of waiting without hope, had become a constant in my life. The worst of it all was not what they did to us, nor what they stole from us. The worst of it all was how it changed us. We were never the same after that night. The city we lived in was no longer a safe place. Every corner of our house, every street, every shadow in the dark became dangerous. Noises that once seemed commonplace to us, footsteps on the sidewalk, the creaking of wood, were no longer normal. They became threats. Fears that once existed only in movies or distant stories materialized in the form of those men, and their memories began to haunt us. We never went out at night again. That part of our life, that part so human, so common, disappeared. And with it, our peace. What I learned that night, what we all learned, is that sometimes terror is not found in dark places or in monsters. Sometimes the real terror is in the simple vulnerability of being human, in how fragile we are, and how easily everything we know and love can disappear. Fear persists. It never goes away completely. What I learned from that experience is that sometimes the greatest damage is not what is done to you, but what you are left with when it is all gone. Because in life, we never know how much control we really have, or how easily our security can crumble. And when fear takes hold of you, there's no turning back. What remains is not what you were, but what you have become after facing that shadow. And never forget that, somewhere, that shadow is still waiting. The rain was hitting the windshield of my car hard, creating a myriad of smudges that made it difficult to see, but I didn't care. My mind was too focused on what was about to happen. The lights of the city reflected distorted on the wet asphalt, and the feeling of being watched became more and more overwhelming. The humidity was soaking my bones, and the deafening noise of the water hitting everything in its path kept me tense, alert. I knew there was no turning back, that at that moment I was too deep inside, too compromised to think about getting out. However, something inside me told me that this would end badly. I had accepted a case that had been presented to me as simple, routine. Marcos Fernandez, a wealthy and powerful businessman, had disappeared. No one seemed to know about him. His family was searching for him. His associates were demanding answers, and the authorities were more interested in keeping calm than in finding the truth. What could have happened to a man like him? The question was constantly on my mind, but it wasn't until I started scratching the surface that I realized what I was really investigating. Marcos's trail led me to something much darker than I had imagined. This was not just an ordinary disappearance. This was something much more sinister. The Fernandez family was involved in a human trafficking ring, something they were hiding well, but which I had begun to discover by accident. At first, I believed that the people who had disappeared under their influence were just more victims of a power structure that controlled the city in the shadows. But then the pieces fell into place. Marcos Fernandez's disappearance was not a simple escape from his public life. It was the result of a much bigger play, a settling of scores. As I got deeper into the investigation, I began to feel the pressure of being in a dangerous zone. The pieces of the puzzle became more and more complicated, and the rain kept falling, as if it were the only constant companion in my search. I felt the weight of the truth pressing down on me, like a distant echo, and the red emergency lights glowing in the distance did not help to calm me. The wind howled between the buildings, like a warning I didn't want to hear, but the persuasiveness of the case was pushing me on. The people behind all this weren't just dangerous, they were relentless. It wasn't the first time I had encountered criminals, but what I discovered about this case was different. This group of people not only had money and power, they also had a network of connections so vast that not even the authorities could stand up to them. I knew that my movements were being watched, that any false move could cost me my life. But that was my job, and although the threats had become more frequent, I could not give up. I could not let fear dictate my decisions. The days began to turn dark, not only because of the storm that seemed to give no respite, but because of the way the pieces of my investigation were connecting with each other. The traces of Marcos Fernandez pointed to an uninhabited area on the outskirts of the city, a place forgotten by everyone, where the lights barely reached, and the only sound that could be heard was the rustling of trees and the roar of the storm. It was there that I found the first real clue. In an abandoned house, under the dust and damp, I found a photograph. It was crumpled, faded, but I could still make out a group of people in it. Marcos Fernandez was there, in the center, smiling with other figures I recognized immediately. They were not his associates or people from his close circle. They were unknown faces, but their eyes, those eyes were looking at me as if they were waiting for me to discover what I did not want to see. The photograph was the key to understand everything, and although I knew that what came next would be much darker, I could not stop. Marcos Fernandez's fate was linked to something much bigger than I had imagined. The human trafficking network was not just a front for his illicit business. It was his life, his obsession, and I had fallen into his trap. It wasn't just about him, about a missing man. It was much more personal. The further I went on, the more I realized that those behind all this did not hesitate to eliminate any threat that stood in their way. And now, I was that threat. I distinctly remember the night everything changed. The rain was pounding against my window hard, and on my desk rested the last pieces of information I had gotten. I was exhausted, my eyes burning from so many hours in front of the computer and the papers cluttered around me. I hadn't eaten in hours, but my stomach didn't feel hungry. I just had the feeling that something was coming. I knew I had touched a sensitive nerve, and as always happens in these cases, enemies are quick to act. I didn't hear the first noise, but I heard the second, a faint rustling at my office door. The rain continued its monotonous march, but the air felt thick, heavy. Then, the sound came again, this time louder. The door slowly opened, and without my being able to do anything, everything vanished in a tense sigh. When I awoke, I was no longer in my office. I was tied up, in a dark place, not knowing how I had gotten there. My head was spinning, my body ached, and the only sound I could hear was the incessant pounding of the rain. I didn't know how much time had passed, or if I was still in the same city. The red emergency lights had never stopped flashing in my mind, but now they were far away, like an echo I couldn't reach. I knew I had crossed a line of no return, that my life was no longer worth anything to those who controlled the game. Hours passed, perhaps days, until a door opened and a shadow approached me. I didn't see his face. I only felt his presence, his cold gaze that seemed to see right through me. It took me a couple of seconds to understand that, although everything I had experienced up to that moment had been a game of shadows and mirages, my investigation had not only unveiled the truth, but had placed me at the center of something much more dangerous than I had imagined. Then I understood something fundamental. The truth does not always set you free. Sometimes, the truth consumes you, and in the end, you are left with nothing but a sense of emptiness. I thought that justice was my purpose, that finding out what was happening would be enough to stop them, to save the victims who were trapped in that net. But I soon realized that I had underestimated what was at stake. My life, My principles were no longer important. The rain continued to fall that night, and when the sun reappeared, it was too late for me. I never found Marcos Fernandez, nor did I discover all that was behind his disappearance. But one thing had become clear. In a world like this, where power and corruption are intertwined with life itself, there are those who are willing to pay any price to keep their secrets. And when one dares to uncover those secrets, the only certainty that remains is the inevitability of darkness. The case was never closed. The pieces of the puzzle remained scattered, without a clear order, like fragments of a broken reality. Sometimes the truth does not have a happy ending, and pursuing it without considering the consequences can be a condemnation. Humans are capable of much, both the best and the worst, and often the shadows they drag are the ones that mark the fate of those who dare to pursue them. Justice, when it intersects with power, often becomes a chimera, a pipe dream, and all that remains is the memory of those who dared to look beyond what they should. The rain was falling like a dense blanket over the city. It was an unusually heavy storm for this season, and its drops not only soaked the streets, but seemed to want to erase any vestige of what was once the normal life of this place. The old buildings that stood like ghosts of a prosperous past no longer seemed able to withstand so much weight. The biting wind shook the branches of the trees, and the sound of thunder boomed in my ears, as if the sky itself was rumbling in fury. But in my mind, that rain was not just a meteorological phenomenon. It was a reflection of what had happened, what was about to happen, and what I could no longer change. My name is Braulio Saldivar. I am a doctor, specialized in areas affected by natural disasters, and in recent years, I have also been part of rescue and security teams. I have been called many times to assist communities devastated by earthquakes, tsunamis, hurricanes, but I never, ever imagined that a natural disaster could drag me so deeply into a moral and emotional abyss. About 2 weeks ago, I received a call that would change my life. A major earthquake had struck a nearby region, an area that was once a thriving agricultural and mining community. In less than a few hours, everything had been reduced to rubble. Collapsed buildings, shattered houses, entire families missing under tons of concrete and mud. The local authorities, completely overwhelmed, had requested emergency assistance. As part of the medical support team, I was assigned to a field unit. My mission was clear: to assist survivors, provide medical care, and try to save as many lives as possible. The first few days were a mixture of chaos and routine. There were seriously injured, trapped people, and of course, despair. The hospital infrastructure was completely collapsed, and medical resources were limited. In my field unit, the shortage of supplies was palpable. Not only were we working under pressure, but every day seemed like a struggle to maintain hope in the midst of suffering. But that's when I began to notice something strange. Medical supplies in my custody began to disappear. At first I thought it was a mistake in the inventory, that perhaps some distribution had gone wrong, but I soon realized that this was not the case. In the last few nights, some colleagues began to act strangely. There were evasive looks, nervousness. As soon as I entered the storage rooms, something didn't fit. Missing medication bottles, bandages, and surgical supplies that were no longer in place. I knew something was wrong, and the trail of these anomalies led me to discover something even more disturbing. One day, after a supply truck arrived at the base, I noticed 2 people in the field. One of them seemed to be working strangely, as if he was trying to go unnoticed. When I asked him to help me with a task, something about his face struck me as odd. He was afraid. I couldn't explain it, but the feeling that something wasn't right intensified. That night, I began to investigate on my own. I was no novice in situations like this. I had worked in conflict zones, in regions where chaos was the norm, and I knew how to spot patterns of behavior that indicated something out of the ordinary. What I discovered was frightening. Medical supplies were not being wasted. They were being stolen, diverted into a human trafficking ring. An organized group had infiltrated the disaster zone, taking advantage of the confusion and chaos to divert resources intended to save lives. It was not the first time I had heard of such practices. Criminal networks that take advantage of vulnerable situations are a sadly common occurrence, but I never imagined I was so close to one. The more I investigated, the clearer it became that this network was not only interested in trafficking medical supplies. There was something else, something much darker at play. The same day I discovered the magnitude of the operation, something unexpected happened. One of the leaders of this organization, known as the Snake, had been trapped under the rubble during the earthquake. Part of his command structure had been destroyed, but he, by some miracle, had survived. The news reached me through a messenger who, visibly nervous, handed me a letter containing a clear warning. "Save the serpent, or you will die." The man needed urgent medical attention, and the only place where he could be saved was the field hospital where I was working. At first, I refused to help. I didn't want to get involved, but I knew I couldn't escape. When I met the other members of the organization, they gave me a choice I couldn't refuse: save him, or face even worse consequences. I had no choice. The choices were clear and simple: save him, or endanger my life and the lives of everyone else. Reluctantly, I made my way to the makeshift facility where the Snake was being kept. His injuries were severe. The earthquake had taken its toll, but the worst was not just the physical damage. The man was full of arrogance, of a coldness that seemed to go deeper than any wound. His life, on his own terms, was worthless to me. But I knew that if I did not act, they would not hesitate to take drastic measures. My work as a doctor had never prepared me to deal with this type of person. Saving him was not easy. Every moment was a struggle, not only to keep him alive, but also to control the rage that was growing inside me. I knew I was not saving an innocent person. I was prolonging the existence of a monster, a man who had shattered as many lives as the earthquake itself. But if I didn't, my life, and the lives of others already trapped in this circle of death, would also be in danger. El Serpiente managed to survive, and once he recovered, the dynamic changed. They didn't just let me go. They did me a favor. I no longer posed a threat. To them, I was just another tool, someone who had played his part in the plot, but was no longer of value. They let me escape, but not without consequences. What I had done would haunt me forever. When I finally left that facility, the rain was still falling. I was no longer the same Braulio who had come here to help. My soul had become corrupted, as if a part of me had been sucked into the darkness of everything I had witnessed and participated in. I didn't know how to react. I didn't know whether to return to my former life or stay and fight the demons that now inhabited my mind. The city was in ruins. The desolate landscape was an exact reflection of what I felt inside. I walked for hours, aimlessly, not knowing what to do with the information I had, with the decisions I had made. My mind was clouded, full of questions I didn't want to answer. Had I done the right thing? Had I saved someone out of obligation or out of fear? Justice was no longer so clear, and my morality had been tested in a way I never imagined. Soon after I quit my job, I stopped being the doctor in the hot spots, stopped being the man who gave himself to saving lives in the midst of disaster. I could no longer live in the same light, not when I knew that everything I had done had been to protect a monster. I knew that I could never erase what had happened, that something inside me had broken in an irreparable way. Today, as I look back, I realize something profound. The line between right and wrong is not as sharp as I used to think. Morality, ethics, all that defines us, can vanish in the blink of an eye when circumstances push us into dark places. The truth is, in the end, we are all susceptible to falling into the trap of our own decisions. Maybe not all of us, but at some point in our lives, we all face the dilemma of choosing between what is right and what survival compels us. Life is never as clear as we think it is. The storm is not always visible until we are already in it. And once the rain soaks us, there is no turning back. I am no longer the same Braulio who came here with the intention of saving lives. The war I fought, though silent and hidden in the shadows of a natural disaster, left scars on my soul that I will never heal. And perhaps in some dark place, someone else will pay the price for my choices. My name is Marcos, and what else could I say? I am a man who survived a plane crash, a crash that threw me into the darkest jungle, more unforgiving than I ever imagined. No one taught me what fear really is until that moment, and unfortunately, I was not alone in the storm that ensued. The worst part wasn't the plane crash or the chaos or the screaming. No. The worst part was what happened next. And now, years later, it still haunts me. Because, even though I made it out alive, something inside me was forever changed. I remember the sound of the plane as it began to crumble. First a dull crunch, and then everything shook. The world disintegrated beneath my feet. The feeling was like a steel fist hitting me in the chest. The screams around me were a mixture of despair and panic. There was no time to think about what or why. We were just falling. My mind shut down, and when I regained consciousness, I was in the middle of total chaos. I wasn't sure how much time had passed, or how I had managed to survive, but there I was, lying on the ground. The air smelled of wet earth, of decomposition. I looked around and saw debris strewn all over the jungle, parts of the plane shattered. The memory of what was once an aircraft now turned into a pile of twisted metal. The jungle was vast, enclosed, and dark. Only a couple of dull lights were visible in the distance. At first, I tried to look for the other survivors, but soon realized that there were only a few of us left, and most were in no condition to move. The screams quickly died down, drowned out by the heavy humidity and dense vegetation. I got up as best I could. My body ached in every corner, but the physical pain didn't matter as much as the other. Fear. The storm, which had already begun to rage furiously, made the ground slippery and dangerous. The wind was not just a wind. It seemed to want to rip the life out of everything it touched. I looked up at the sky, so heavy it seemed ready to fall on me. And then, the first clap of thunder. Panic forced me to run. I ran into the jungle, aimlessly, without a clear goal, only the desire to get away from that disaster, from the death that was looming over us. My mind was blank. Adrenaline kept me on my feet, on the move. The water began to fall with such intensity that I was instantly drenched. The sound of the rain, mixed with the roar of the wind and the crash of thunder, was deafening. But in spite of everything, there was something else in the air, something I could not identify, something that made me feel watched. In the first few minutes, I was concerned with immediate survival, finding water, food, shelter, but soon that concern turned into something much more frightening. Someone was following me. I couldn't see him, but I could feel him. The feeling of being watched was not paranoia. It was real. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, something to do with the chaos of the accident, with the other survivors. But then the footsteps became clearer. They were slow, cautious, and seemed to be getting closer. My breathing quickened, and I realized I had to move fast. I ran for hours without rest. My body was screaming at me to stop, to rest, but the inner voice telling me I had to run was much stronger. I couldn't stay there. I couldn't let them catch me. I didn't understand why, but I knew that if they found me, it wouldn't be for a simple matter of survival. I wasn't the target, but the package that the plane was carrying, that damn package that I didn't even know what it contained, was. My mind began to wander, but it always came back to that same thought. There was something in that package, something that someone would do anything to get. Although I didn't understand exactly what was going on, I knew. It wasn't just an accident. There were people in that jungle, and those people were not going to leave me alone until they got what they wanted. And I had unwittingly become their target. In the days that followed, the jungle became my worst enemy. The humidity was unbearable, the air thick and heavy. The sound of the storm never ceased. and the shadows seemed to take on a life of their own. Hunters stalked me from the shadows, always at a distance. I knew this because, though I could not see them, I felt their presence. The rustling of the branches, the subtle movement of the vegetation, everything told me that I was not alone. Every day I spent in that jungle, I felt more trapped. The feeling of claustrophobia was unbearable, even though I was in an open space. Every corner of the jungle seemed like a labyrinth with no way out. The trees, the bushes, the undergrowth, everything was against me. It was no longer just the jungle that haunted me, it was desperation. The feeling of being hunted. Days turned into weeks, and as time passed, the fear only increased. But I could not give up. I couldn't let myself get caught. Not now. Sometimes, at night, when the rain calmed down a bit and the jungle was strangely silent, I could hear footsteps approaching, as if those hunters were waiting for the exact moment to strike the final blow. Fear had made me paranoid. I didn't know if my senses were playing tricks on me or if they were really watching me. At some point, I began to doubt my own instincts. I remember one particular early morning. The rain stopped for a brief moment, and in that deep silence, I heard a whisper. It was not a human whisper. It was something else. I didn't know if my mind was playing tricks on me, or if someone was really nearby, but the fact is, that feeling of being watched intensified. My pulse quickened, and I hid under a fallen log, hoping no one would see me. It was hours before I dared to come out, but when I did, the landscape had changed. The sky was covered with dark clouds, and the jungle seemed even denser, more alive. And at that moment, I knew I was being surrounded. It was no longer a mere sensation. There was something else, something tangible. It was them. I decided I had to get to a nearby village, a place where I could call for help. I didn't know how much time I had left, but the jungle was no longer the most dangerous place. No, the real dangers were hidden in the shadows of the men. They were looking for me, and they knew it. They knew who I was and what I was carrying. And though I tried to escape, something inside me told me that no matter how far I went, I would never be safe. When I finally reached the small village, the sense of relief was only momentary. The gazes of the inhabitants were not those of ordinary people. They were the looks of those who knew something was wrong, but didn't know what exactly. I felt that they were watching me, that my presence made them uneasy. But the worst of all was not that look, nor the shadows that followed me. The worst thing was realizing that, although I had managed to escape physically, my mind was still trapped in the jungle, surrounded by hunters, shadows, and echoes of footsteps that never stopped chasing me. And something inside me told me that, although I was now safe, that feeling of being watched would never leave me. Because when men become hunters, the jungle is no longer the only danger. The real fear, the one that follows me to this day, is the human capacity to hunt and destroy what they do not understand. 10 years have passed. 10 years since my brother Juan disappeared from home. And although I have tried, I have not been able to stop thinking about that night, about the emptiness he left, about the unanswered questions. I clearly remember the rain. That storm that started when the clock struck 2 a.m. It was the kind of storm that seemed to have no end. A storm that rumbled the roof of the house and darkened the landscape into a sea of shadows. The air was heavy, charged with something that I didn't know how to describe, but that at that moment made me feel like the whole world had stopped. And then, when I got to his room and saw the letter on his bed, I understood that nothing would ever be the same again. It is the best thing for you. I protect you, Uriel. Don't look for more. Don't do it. The worst is yet to come, and I am the only one who can keep you safe. I never quite understood what all that meant. Why did he leave? Why didn't he tell me? What was he doing at that moment that he couldn't share with his brother, with his family? There were no other clues in the letter. Only her handwriting, which seemed hurried, with words blurred by anxiety. There were no addresses or explanations, only the warning, look no further. But I couldn't help myself. In my mind, doubt grew like a dense fog. What secrets was he keeping? What life was my brother living that had forced him to leave it all behind? For the next few years, I tried to get on with my life, but the emptiness of his absence never left. The rain, that endless storm, kept pounding on my window every time I thought of him. I didn't know what to do with the pain, so I let it grow, fed by the silence of the empty house. Every time someone mentioned his name to me, I felt as if an invisible weight was crushing my chest. But a few days ago, everything changed. The messages started coming in. First, it was small details, something that might have gone unnoticed if I wasn't so attentive to everything about him. An unknown number on my phone, a text message I wasn't expecting. It said only, "They are looking for you. What your brother started, there is no end to it. Close the door, because they are already close." At first, I thought someone was messing with me, maybe a friend trying to scare me, a joke. But it wasn't a joke. The next day, I found a note pinned to my apartment door. "You've made a bad decision. It's time for you to find out the truth." The letter was unsigned, but it was clear in its message. My brother Juan was involved in something bigger than I imagined, something dangerous. And now, I was involved too. At first, I tried to ignore the warnings, live in ignorance, let it all fade away. But the feeling of being watched began to take hold of me. I felt someone's presence behind me, as if I were being followed, and every time I looked out the window, the rain offered me only diffuse shadows. No one had touched me, but every time I came across a new clue, fear began to creep into my mind, to stir my conscience. Today, as the storm lashed the city with unparalleled fury, I decided I was going to start looking. I could no longer live in doubt, in fear. I needed answers. I went to her old apartment. The building was so quiet that I felt as if time had stopped there. The lights flickered intermittently, which made me feel even more uncomfortable. As I walked through the halls, each step echoed strangely, as if someone was waiting for me to arrive. As I approached his old door, I felt my heart begin to race. I was alone, but I could feel that I was not. The door was locked, but there was something strange. An envelope, sloppily left on the floor, with my name written on it. The inside contained only a crumpled sheet of paper and an address. The handwriting was not my brother's, but the style and urgency were unmistakable. "The house on the hill. The road is not safe. You are late." What awaited me at the indicated address completely changed my perception of everything. The house was on the outskirts of town, at the end of a dusty road, surrounded by leafy trees that seemed ready to swallow any hint of light. It was dark, lifeless, but something pushed me to continue. The door opened effortlessly, as if someone had already anticipated my arrival. The air was damp, the dampness penetrated my clothes, and the cold was gripping my bones. I entered the house not knowing what to expect. There was something sinister about the place. The broken furniture and the dust in the air gave the feeling of abandonment. But the strangest thing of all was that there was something very human, that could be breathed in every corner. It was as if someone was there, watching my every move. In one of the rooms, I saw an object on the floor. It was a clock, an antique clock that looked vaguely familiar. I took it in my hands, and as I turned it over, I saw an inscription on the back. "Time is running out for everyone." Suddenly, something stopped me. A sound. It was subtle, but I could hear it. A breath that wasn't mine. My blood froze instantly. I set the watch on the floor and stepped back, my eyes searching every corner, but there was nothing physical. But I felt it. Someone was there. Someone had been there all along. The message was clear. My brother had been involved in something much bigger than I could have ever imagined. Something that had dragged him into this darkness, and now, that darkness loomed over me. I couldn't escape. I couldn't leave the house without facing what I had started. Almost without realizing it, I began to pace the house in search of more clues. Each step I took seemed heavier than the last. The floorboards creaked under my feet, as if the house itself was groaning under the weight of what had happened within its walls. The rain was pounding hard on the windows, but its sound was becoming more and more distant, as if the water itself was being absorbed by the earth. I passed through the kitchen, which was in complete disarray. There were broken cups on the floor, old food decomposing on the table, but what caught my eye most was a metal box hidden under the sink. I opened it carefully. Inside were several photos of my brother, some of them recent, some of them older. What surprised me most was a photo in which he was surrounded by other people, all with blurred faces, as if someone had tried to hide their identities. Suddenly, I understood what I was seeing. My brother was not alone. He had been part of something that involved people whose power or influence was so great that it had erased his tracks. And somehow, it was all catching up with me. The web my brother had formed, the same one that had made him disappear, was now reaching out to me. I decided I had to get out of there. I no longer knew if I could trust what I was seeing, what was happening to me. But before I turned around, something else caught my attention. A noise behind me. A faint noise, but so clear that it made me stop in my tracks, as if someone was walking in the shadows. I knew instantly I was trapped. I didn't know if someone had been following me all this time, or if the time had simply come when they knew I had discovered too much. But the feeling of being watched was no longer just an intuition. It was an absolute certainty. With my heart in my throat, I ran for the exit. The door seemed more and more distant. As I reached it, I felt something or someone tap me on the shoulder. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. Nothing visible, at least. Just the rain, which continued to fall as if there was no end to it. As I walked back toward town, my mind began to process what I had found in that house, what it meant. The network my brother had left behind didn't just involve me. It wasn't an accident, not a fluke. There was something bigger at stake, something that surpassed any understanding I might have had. In the distance, the lights of the city twinkled in the distance, but something told me I shouldn't go back. It was no longer safe. The truth, though cruel, was there, right in front of me, darker and more dangerous than I had imagined. The only thing I knew for certain was that I could no longer turn back. And just like the storm that kept battering the city, the truth, that truth I had sought so hard, was catching up with me. And with it, my fate was sealed. The search, the need to know, had become a condemnation. But life, like rain, continues to fall, inexorably, even when there is no escape. The search for truth is a dangerous path. Often what we think we want can end up destroying us. Curiosity drives us, but knowledge can be too high a price to pay. Sometimes secrets should not be unearthed, for those around us, and those who chose to remain silent, have their own motives for keeping the shadows, and if we choose to enter them, there is no way back. Silence holds its own demons, and not all of them are meant to be revealed. 5 years ago, my life was different. I was full of certainties, with my girlfriend Maria by my side. We were young, we enjoyed the little things, a walk in the city, a coffee in the early morning, the Christmas lights illuminating the cold December streets. The night of that story began as just another one. One of those nights that seem to be ordinary, but that in retrospect, you realize that they mark a before and an after. It was a rainy night, like many others this time of year. The drops were hitting the windshield hard, creating a constant sound that mixed with the soft music playing on the radio. Maria and I had decided to take a walk to see the Christmas lights that decorated downtown. We enjoyed doing this every year, losing track of time as we watched the colorful lights reflect the magic of the season. The air was cold and the rain wouldn't let up, but we didn't care. We were together. I drove the car with one hand on the steering wheel and the other on Maria's, resting on her lap, watching the lights. Everything seemed perfect. Suddenly, the silence of the night was interrupted by the sound of her cell phone vibrating on the seat. Maria looked at it, puzzled, and when she saw the sender's name, her face changed. I quickly realized that something wasn't right. "It's my dad," she said, in a tone I didn't like. He picked up the phone quickly, as if he didn't want me to see it, but I couldn't help noticing that his hand was shaking slightly as he unlocked the screen. Then he read the message silently. "Maria, come quickly. Your father is in very bad health." She didn't say anything to me at first. She simply put the phone away in her purse and, with a somewhat distracted look, asked me to take the shortest way home. The urgency in her voice was palpable, but there was something about her attitude that made me uncomfortable. It was as if he didn't quite believe what he had just read. Without a word, she turned to the window, as if the fading landscape before her eyes was the only thing that could calm her. Soon after, I found myself speeding up the car. The raindrops were getting heavier, and the traffic on the road was getting thicker as we approached her house. Each red light that turned red delayed us further, increasing Maria's anxiety. My mind was filled with doubts, but I didn't want to show concern. She was nervous enough as it was. When we arrived at her house, the first thing I noticed was that the lights were off. Maria's house was never that dark. She always had a light on in the foyer, and her mother used to leave a lamp on in the hallway so it wouldn't look uninhabited. I didn't like the desolate feeling the place exuded. Maria got out of the car before I could come to a complete stop. She was running towards the door, not looking back, as if she was running away. I stood there, staring at the closed door, with a growing sense of discomfort. I didn't know what it was, but something told me that all was not well. I decided to follow her. I had no other choice. As I entered, I noticed something strange. The house, normally warm and welcoming, felt empty. There was a cold air in the rooms, and the silence was oppressive. There was no sign of life, neither her mother nor her father. In the hallway, the only light came from a dim lamp flickering in the distance. Maria stepped forward, calling for her father, but received no answer. She began to walk quickly toward the upstairs rooms, but I stood there hesitating. Something was not right. I decided to follow her, but before going upstairs, I looked at the phone she still carried in her hand. I saw it vibrate again, and this time, the message wasn't from her father. It was a different one. A message that made my heart race. "You've arrived just in time. Now you're both inside. There's no way out." My blood froze instantly. Without saying anything to Maria, I tried to read the rest of the message, but it was impossible. Maria called me from upstairs, and I could do nothing but put the phone away and follow her. I went up the stairs after her. The trembling light illuminated only a few meters, making the darkness of the hallway seem even denser. As I reached the top, I saw Maria standing in front of the door to her parents' bedroom, her hand on the knob, looking in. Her face, once full of despair, was now pale, as if frozen. When I entered the room, I understood why. Her parents' room was empty. There was no one there. But what really froze my blood were the messy furniture and the open window through which the rain was pouring in, soaking the floor of the room. The feeling of being watched was unbearable. Before I could say anything, we heard a noise coming from the first floor, a heavy sound, as if someone was walking. Maria reacted quickly and went to the phone to call the police, but just as she was dialing, the phone stopped working. The message she had received earlier, the one mentioning our arrival, was no longer on her screen. The silence that followed was so thick I could almost hear my own heartbeat. The danger was real. We didn't know who was behind it or what they wanted. Desperation took hold of us. Maria tried to open a window to get out, but it was locked. I, for my part, tried to find a way out, but the doors were locked. The rain was still falling, but it no longer felt like a storm. It felt like punishment. Then, we began to hear footsteps. Footsteps coming from the first floor, approaching, slowly. There were no screams, no noises, just footsteps. Suddenly, I understood what was happening. Those who had brought us there were not looking for their sick father. They had caught us in a trap. They had created an illusion for us to come. Mary's message, her sick father, It had all been part of a plan. For what seemed like an eternity, we searched for some way to escape, but the house seemed to close in around us. We were trapped, and our only option was to wait. Wait for someone, anyone, to hear us. Finally, after 3 hours of anguish, we heard sirens in the distance. At first, I didn't believe them, but hope flared in my chest when I saw the lights shining through the window. The policemen arrived quickly, but the rescue was not as easy as I had hoped. They entered the house cautiously, searching room by room, until they found us. The feeling of relief was overwhelming, but at the same time, a sense of emptiness came over me. The police found no one else in the house. We never knew who was responsible for it, or why they chose us. All that remained were the marks of fear, the unanswered questions. The truth is that it was no ordinary kidnapping. Something darker was hidden in that night, something that never came to light. Now, 5 years later, Maria and I are still together, but it is no longer the same. The trust we once shared has vanished into thin air, like the fog of that stormy night. The fear, though no longer as palpable, is still present. We don't talk much about what happened. It's as if it never happened. Or perhaps rather, as if it will never stop happening. The lesson that night left us with, the lesson that still haunts me, is that you never know who to really trust. People can be kind, even charming, but we all have secrets, and some are much darker than one might imagine. Those secrets, the ones you can't see with the naked eye, can drag us into dark places that we never really get out of. And even if we think we're safe, the fear never completely goes away. Sometimes it just waits, silently, for us to forget it's there. And by the time we become aware of its presence, it's too late. Trust is fragile. In life, we encounter situations that change us, that mark us in ways we cannot foresee. Human beings have an unfathomable capacity to lie, manipulate, and hide their true intentions. We never know who is waiting for us to let our guard down, or what dark shadow is hiding behind a smile. The truth is that the only certainty we have is that the danger may be much closer than we imagine. The city had been my home all my life. Its crowded streets, skyscraping buildings, and constant cacophony of honking horns seemed as familiar as my own breathing. But that night, under the weight of an incessant rain, everything felt different. The drops hit the windows of the buildings with a violence that seemed disproportionate, while the gray sky hid any hope of clarity. In the midst of that storm, my life was about to fall apart. My name is Philip, a businessman who had always relied on order and predictability. Every day was meticulously planned, every decision calculated, but order was gone. It started as something small, an unsettling feeling of being watched, of something being out of place. For the first few days, I chalked it up to stress. After all, running a company was no easy task. But the signs intensified, a recurring shadow in the periphery of my vision, a black car that seemed to follow me, unfamiliar faces crossing my path more often than was normal. That night, as I walked to my car in my office parking lot, the rain was so heavy that it seemed to envelop everything in a veil of noise and darkness. The sound of my footsteps echoed off the wet concrete, but there was something else, something barely perceptible, an echo that didn't belong to me. I stopped, tried to calm myself, but my pulse was racing. I looked around and saw nothing, or so I thought. In the distance, a figure faded into the gloom. I decided not to wait to find out and ran to my car. The drive home was torture. The traffic, the rain, and my own paranoia conspired to make every second feel eternal. Arriving at my apartment, I checked every lock, every window, every corner. Something inside me knew I was not safe, but I convinced myself that paranoia was playing a trick on me. Still, that feeling persisted, stuck in my chest like a silent warning. Everything changed the next day. I arrived at my office early, as usual, but something was different. The front door was ajar, something that never happened. I entered cautiously, and what I found inside made my stomach churn. My desk was jumbled, papers scattered about, and in the center, a folder that didn't belong to my company. As I opened it, my blood ran cold. Photographs of meetings I never remembered having, forged documents with my signature on them, and worst of all, a detailed record of illegal transactions that pointed directly at me. I didn't understand. Who would do this? Why? My head was spinning as I tried to find a logical answer. I had done nothing to deserve this, or so I thought. But I soon realized that this wasn't just about destroying my reputation. This went much deeper than that. It was a carefully woven web, a calculated plan to trap me. And the scariest part was that I didn't know who was behind it. Later that night, my phone rang with an unknown number. I didn't answer, but the calls continued, one after another. Then, the messages came. "We know what you did," one said. "There is no escape," said another. I tried to ignore them, but it was impossible. My mind was in a spiral of panic. I decided to stay home, but even there, security was illusory. The surveillance cameras I had installed began to fail, and my email was hacked. Everything indicated that whoever was behind this was resourceful and willing to use any means to ruin me. The next few weeks were hell. My life was falling apart at a speed I couldn't control. Important clients canceled contracts. Trusted associates stopped answering my calls, and my employees looked at me with distrust. But the worst was not the damage to my company. It was the constant fear, the feeling that every dark corner, every shadow, hid a threat. One night, I decided to face my fears. I went through the forged documents, looking for some pattern, some clue that might tell me who was behind it. I found it in an insignificant detail, a recurring name on the documents, someone I knew but hadn't seen in years. This discovery brought me no relief, only more questions. I decided to look for that person, but it was a mistake. Arriving at the place where I expected to find answers, I was greeted by an empty and silent street. The rain continued to fall heavily, creating puddles that reflected the few lights that dared to shine in the darkness. As I waited inside my car, a black vehicle parked nearby. Its presence was ominous, but what came next was worse. 3 figures descended, all dressed in black, their faces hidden under umbrellas that barely protected them from the rain. They walked toward me with a calmness that only increased my terror. I started the car and accelerated, but they did not lag behind. As the kilometers passed, my desperation grew. The maze of city streets I once knew so well was now a nightmare scenario. Every turn seemed to take me further away from safety. Finally, I found a narrow, dark alley where I hid my car, hoping they would pass me by. But the sound of their footsteps in the distance told me I was not safe. That night, I didn't end up at home. I ran until my legs could take no more, finding shelter in a cheap motel on the outskirts of town. My clothes were soaked, my body exhausted, and my mind on the verge of collapse. At that moment, I understood that my life as I knew it was over. I was alone, without allies, without a safe place to turn to. Days passed, and the net that haunted me seemed to close tighter and tighter. I no longer went out without my bodyguard, though I knew that would not guarantee my safety. Every unfamiliar face in the crowd was a potential threat. Every dark corner a trap waiting to close. I lived in constant fear that at any moment it would be the end. The experience taught me something I had not understood before: the fragility of the life we build with so much effort. We always think we are in control, that our decisions protect us, but the truth is that one small false move is all it takes for everything to fall apart. Danger does not always come from dark or unknown places. It is often closer than we imagine, hidden behind smiles and appearances of normality. We live in a world where trust can be a weapon and certainty an illusion. The real terror is not in what we do not see, but in what we deliberately ignore, believing that it will never reach us. The storm that lashed the desert seemed to have a nature alien to anything I had ever known. The wind roared with an almost primitive fury, and the rain, falling in torrents, turned the road into an untamed river of mud and debris. Driving through that nightmare was like driving through a parallel world, one where the rules of reality dissolved and everything seemed on the verge of breaking down. When I made the decision to leave the city and enter the desert, I had done so in search of peace. My life in the metropolis had been a succession of chaos and wrong decisions, a failed attempt to find something that would give me meaning. I thought that there, in the solitude of the desert, I could find answers. But what I found instead was a downward spiral that dragged me into a void from which I wasn't sure I would be able to extricate myself. At first, everything seemed normal. The sun was setting on an endless horizon, and the stillness of the place seemed to offer me the respite I so desperately needed. But that serenity was soon broken. One night, while driving under a sky illuminated by sporadic lightning, something happened. The figure on the road, still and motionless, had broken the balance. My first reaction was to ignore it, but the red symbol on the hood of my truck warned me that something much darker was at play. The feeling of being watched began to intensify. Although I couldn't see anything, instinct told me I was not alone. The flashes of lightning barely illuminated the darkness that was taking over everything, and every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I felt that something was following me, that something or someone was lurking. I decided to continue despite the circumstances, driven by a mixture of fear and hope of finding a way out. But the storm gave no respite, and soon the road seemed to dissolve before my eyes. Everything around me was washed away, as if the rains were washing away reality itself. In my mind, a terrifying thought began to take shape. I wasn't running away. I was being washed away. When I finally found an abandoned shed on the side of the road, I felt I had no choice but to take shelter there. The storm was unbearable, and the fear of being left in the van without a shelter drove me to despair. As I entered the shed, the smell of dampness and old wood enveloped me. The flashlight I carried barely illuminated the space, showing the shadows of rusted tools and weather-worn walls. But it was the notebook in the corner that really caught my attention. The notebook was covered in scribbles, as if someone had written frantically, with no concern for order. As I read, an uneasy feeling came over me. The phrases I encountered seemed to be warnings. They take what you are. Never look back. The mask is the key. The idea that someone might be watching my life, taking it, leaving me empty, began to take over my mind. The paranoia grew. I decided it was best to leave the shed and continue on my way. But as I opened the door, I was met with something far worse. They were there. 3 figures with cloth masks, identical to the one I had found in my truck. They were motionless, watching me from the darkness, as if waiting for me to make a decision. My first impulse was to close the door quickly, but panic prevented me from doing so. Who were they? What did they want from me? In that instant, my entire being focused on a single idea. They couldn't take me. They couldn't do to me what they planned. Somehow, their presence was more terrifying than any nightmarish creature, because their purpose seemed to be more intangible, more psychological. They were not going to destroy me physically, but their goal was something much deeper. Fear gripped me, and without thinking, I burst through the back window, shattering the glass in my desperation. The rain offered no solace, but it gave me a slight advantage, as the darkness and the sound of the storm helped me put distance between us. I ran through the desert, aimlessly, searching for some kind of shelter, some sign that I might escape. The terrain was treacherous and my feet were sinking into the mud. The rain pelted down with more fury, soaking me to the bone. What terrified me most, however, was not the storm or the slippery terrain. It was the knowledge that I was being chased, that something or someone was stalking me, always one step behind me. Finally, after hours of struggling, I saw the faint light of a town in the distance. Relief momentarily filled me, and when I arrived, my hopes were instantly dispelled. The houses were illuminated, but there was not a single person in the streets. The air was heavy, heavy with an unbearable stillness. I looked around, searching for signs of life, but found none. Then, something strange happened. As I passed by a store, I saw a reflection in the window. It was my own face, but it was not as I remembered it. It was covered by a mask, exactly like the ones worn by the figures that were chasing me. My heart skipped a beat. Desperate, I tried to take it off, but the panic only increased. As I looked at myself in the glass case, I felt that I was no longer me, that I had lost something fundamental to my identity, something I could never get back. The feeling of unreality enveloped me completely. I was in a place that was no longer the same, in a town where time seemed to have stopped. But the worst of all was not being trapped in that empty place. Worst of all was the realization that my struggle was not only against those who pursued me, but against something far more insidious, the emptiness left by my own transformation. That night, I understood the cruel lesson the storm had taught me. The real darkness lay not in the masked figures that stalked me, nor in the unstoppable storm that had fallen over the desert. The real threat was far more subtle, far more dangerous. I had been marked, transformed into something I could no longer recognize as mine. In the end, what we fear most is not death or the unknown, but the slow stripping away of who we are. In a world where others can shape our essence, our identity becomes a constant fragility, one that can be snatched away by the shadows that lurk beyond our control. Sometimes, the greatest terror is facing the truth that who we have been, who we thought we were, can disappear without warning. And when that happens, there is nothing left for us to hold on to. Emptiness becomes the only reality we know. The storm was battering me with a fury I could not escape. The wind roared and the huge waves crashed against the hull of my sailboat, a shelter that, at that moment, seemed as fragile as a toy in the midst of the ocean's fury. In the distance, dark clouds covered the entire horizon, without a sign that the storm would let up. It was the kind of storm that leaves no room for hope, the kind of storm that threatens to swallow everything it touches. My name is Samuel, and I am a sailor. I live alone aboard my sailboat, a modest boat that I have learned to know and trust over the years. Since I left the coast and ventured out into the open ocean several weeks ago, my life has been a routine of work, silence, and solitude. The sea is vast and, on many occasions, lonely, but I have grown into it. However, something had changed that night. Something in the air told me I was not alone. The wind cut across my face as I struggled to keep the sailboat heading in the right direction. The nearest lighthouse was miles away, but the storm was pushing me away, pushing me toward an ocean that seemed to have no end. I struggled to stay on course, but the fury of the waves seemed to be stronger than any human will. The rain wouldn't stop falling, and the drops seemed to hammer my skin, leaving me feeling like I was being hit by thousands of needles. Suddenly, I saw it. I wasn't sure if it was an illusion caused by tiredness and confusion, but something on the horizon caught my attention. In the middle of the storm, something was moving, a figure emerging and disappearing among the waves. At first, I thought it was a reflection of the storm itself, a play of light and shadow confusing my vision. But the sense that I was not alone began to grow within me. As I got closer, the figure became clearer. It was not a ship, not a lighthouse, not any sign of life at sea. It was a sailboat, of considerable size, that seemed to be anchored in the middle of the ocean, with no logical reason to be there. There were no lights on its deck, and its structure was dark, as if the storm had engulfed it, covering it with a layer of impenetrable darkness. At first, I thought I was seeing things wrong, that my mind, overloaded by fear and tension, was deceiving me. But when the figure of the sailboat stabilized in my field of vision, I realized that I wasn't imagining anything. I felt a slight twinge of unease, a shiver run down my spine. Something was not right. My seafaring instincts, those that had kept me alive on so many voyages, told me I should turn and walk away. But I didn't. Something inside me was pushing me to get closer, as if curiosity was stronger than fear. I didn't know what drew me into that darkness, but what I did know was that my life, at that moment, depended on not losing sight of that strange sailboat. If I strayed too far, if I got distracted, I could lose sight of it, and that terrified me. I sailed on towards it, my sailboat moving through the waves with the precision of an expert, but without the security of a man who feels at ease. The sound of the wind and waves increased as I got closer, and as the shadows of the other boat became clearer, my mind began to speculate on what might be happening. There were no lights. No one was aboard, and the boat seemed to be drifting. But the worst thing was the feeling that something was not right. My intuition was telling me that I shouldn't go any closer, that what was in front of me was no ordinary thing, no simple accident at sea. Something else was at stake. Suddenly, a gigantic wave hit my sailboat with such force that I was about to lose control. I clung to the wheel with all my strength, struggling to keep the boat from capsizing. When I managed to steady it, I looked back at the strange sailboat. It was much closer now, less than 100 meters away, and something about its structure chilled my blood. It wasn't just the fact that it was there, but there was something else, something in its shape, something I couldn't identify. The rain continued to fall relentlessly, and the wind was relentless. But as he watched the drifting boat, something changed. It was so subtle that, had I not been so alert, I would not have noticed it. A shadow moved across the deck of the sailboat, a figure that appeared and disappeared in the blink of an eye. It was so fleeting that it almost made me doubt what I had seen. But I saw it. I knew it. I was not alone. Someone was there, in that boat, waiting. Anxiety gripped me. Who could be aboard a drifting ship in the middle of a storm? How could he possibly be there without me noticing him before? Something didn't fit, and the sense of danger intensified. Every muscle in my body was tense, every thought fragmented, as if my mind was trying to escape from a truth I didn't want to accept. I decided I had to investigate. Somehow my feet pulled me in that direction, as if I couldn't control them. Fear and curiosity were pushing me closer. My boat glided toward the other sailboat, and as I approached, the figure I had seen on the deck became clearer. It was a man, or at least, it looked like a man. But something in his posture, something in the way he moved, told me he wasn't. Or not entirely. I couldn't look away. The wind was blowing hard, and the storm was pounding relentlessly. But the closer I got, the clearer the figure became. He did not move. He was motionless, standing, watching me. His eyes were not shining, reflecting no light. He was there, but he was not. A feeling of emptiness, as if everything in front of me was just an illusion, began to envelop me. As the meters between us shrank, my mind began to give way. Fear turned to panic. I felt as if I was stepping into an abyss, a darkness that could not be overcome. What terrified me most was not the storm, nor the man on the deck of the other sailboat. What terrified me most was the fact that I couldn't understand what was happening, why I felt as if everything was out of place. It was at that moment that I understood what had happened. The figure on the deck was not just a man. It was someone who was watching me, someone who had been waiting for my arrival. And realizing that, I understood that I could not leave. The sea had trapped me. The storm was not a natural storm, but a storm created to make me feel powerless, to push me towards something I did not understand. Suddenly, the whole ocean seemed to become one. I was no longer on a sailboat, no longer in control. I was trapped in a maze with no way out, a maze created by the very sea that had given me life. Now, from the shelter of my sailboat, with the sound of the storm as my only companion, I understood that there was nothing I could do. The The darkness of the ocean was not just the storm or the night. It was the feeling of being trapped in a cycle that cannot be broken, of being watched, but unable to see who or what is stalking you. The lesson is clear. We are not always in control of our lives, and sometimes what we fear most is not the danger outside, but what the ocean of fear can do inside us. The sea is unpredictable, but what really terrifies us is the fact that we will never know whether we are being guided towards the light or dragged into the depths. When the rain began to fall that afternoon, I had no idea that it would be the beginning of something that would transform my life forever. It was not an ordinary storm, like the ones that sometimes made me feel a rare sense of calm. This one was different, an intense rain, almost furious, that pounded hard on the glass of the windows as if the sky was overflowing without any control. At the time, it all seemed to be just a passing downpour, but it soon became the unsettling backdrop of a scenario I could not predict. My name is Javier, and I am a freelance graphic designer. I live alone in a small apartment in the center of the city, a cozy space that allows me to concentrate on my work and enjoy my quiet life. It's been days since the daily routines seem to repeat themselves over and over again. The search for new projects, the endless nights in front of the computer, the coffee that never fails, and the few social interactions I have. A simple and quiet life, far from complications. Or at least, that's what I thought. A couple of weeks before the storm started, I had accepted a friend request on one of my social networks. It was a common occurrence. It wasn't the first time someone I didn't know had asked me to connect. Most of the time, people add me for reasons I'm not too interested in. Maybe someone saw some work I had posted or liked my photos. But on this occasion, the name that popped up was unfamiliar to me. There was no profile picture, just an empty silhouette. Anyway, I accepted the request without giving it much thought. For the first few days, the interaction was completely normal. A couple of casual messages, a couple of design questions, some trivial comments, and nothing else. Nothing that made me suspect that anything might be out of place. But as the days went by, something changed. The messages started to become more personal. They weren't direct threats or aggressive words, but there was something unsettling about them. There were details about my life that only someone very close to me would know. Details I hadn't shared anywhere online. My schedule, places I used to go, the coffee I liked. At first, I thought maybe he had mistaken me for someone else, that it was a coincidence, but as the messages continued, that idea quickly faded. I couldn't ignore it. Someone was watching me. Someone knew more about me than I was comfortable knowing. The worst came when fake posts started appearing on my social media. Edited photos of me, digitally manipulated to create situations that had never happened. Comments I hadn't made, but were so well constructed that they seemed completely plausible. My followers were fed misrepresented information about my personal and professional life. At first, I wasn't too concerned, because I thought someone had simply had too much time on their hands and was having fun. But as the messages began to pile up, the situation became untenable. People were writing to me worried, asking me if these posts were true. Some were even asking me for clarification about what they were seeing on my profile. My anxiety began to grow, not because of the posts themselves, but because of the feeling that someone else was in control of my image, of my story. The part that puzzled me the most was that I didn't know who was behind it all. I didn't understand why or what purpose someone could have for doing something like that. And yet it was clear that the situation was getting out of control. One rainy afternoon, like so many others, everything took a turn. I was working in my study, sitting in front of the screen, when I saw something I had never expected. On the door of my apartment was a note. It was crumpled, wet from the pouring rain, and had something handwritten on it. The handwriting was irregular, as if the person who had written it was nervous or in a hurry. There was no signature, just an address and a few words. "I know what you've done." My heart skipped a beat. A shiver ran down my spine, and for a moment, I stood there motionless, staring at the door. My first impulse was to look out the window, but there was no one in sight. The sound of the storm was all around me, but there was something in the air, something in the stillness I felt that told me I was not alone. It was a few minutes, perhaps longer than I would have liked, before I managed to muster the courage to lock the door and walk away. Fear, though irrational at first, began to settle in my chest. Who could have left that note? How did that person know something so private? My mind began to wander, searching for explanations, but none seemed reasonable enough. The rain continued to fall, and with it, the anxiety intensified. The messages began to become more direct. They were no longer vague insinuations or strange comments. They became clear threats, as if the stranger knew exactly how to make me feel vulnerable. Over the next few hours, the storm not only lashed at my window, but also stalked me, even inside my own home. The notifications on my phone went on and on. Each message I received seemed more disturbing than the last. The fake posts became more elaborate, more complex. The questions about my personal life increased. My profile had been completely distorted. I could no longer leave the network. I could no longer escape. The night came without respite. Physical fatigue added to the psychological fatigue, but the anguish of not knowing what to do kept me awake. It was then that I heard something. A soft knock on the door. I didn't recognize it right away. I thought it might be the wind or the rain hitting the glass. But then I heard it again, louder this time, accompanied by the sound of footsteps, something that didn't belong in my house. It couldn't be my imagination. Someone was outside. My heart was pounding as I tried to rationalize the situation. But what paralyzed me was the certainty that I could not stay there. I could not stay alone with that feeling of being watched. With a tremor in my hands, I picked up the phone and dialed the police number. "Someone is outside," I said haltingly. "They are watching my house. I don't know what to do." The wait was interminable. My mind kept racing, trying to decipher who could be there. Every time I looked out the window, the darkness answered me, and the figure of the man remained on the other side, motionless. Every second of waiting seemed like an eternity. Finally, the blue and red lights of the patrol cars broke the darkness. At that precise moment, the figure disappeared, as if he had never been there. The policemen searched the area but found nothing. No one was nearby. There was no confrontation, no struggle, just the sound of rain and wind. The worst thing was the emptiness left by his presence. No one could explain it. No one knew who he was or why he had done it. The feeling of being watched did not leave me. The following days became a nightmare. Every time the rain started to fall, I felt that pressure, that anxiety of knowing that someone might be watching me, waiting for the right moment to make their move. Today, when I think about everything that happened, there is something I can't help but reflect on. Real terror doesn't always come in the form of physical threats or monsters hiding in the dark. Sometimes, the greatest fear comes from what we don't understand, from what we can't control. Worst of all is not what we see, but what we don't see. In a world where everything is interconnected, where we share fragments of our lives as normal, what happens out of sight can be far more frightening than we imagine. This incident taught me a very clear lesson. We live in an era where connectivity exposes us to risks we cannot foresee. The information we share, the digital footprints we leave behind, become more than just data. They can be the basis of a fear we cannot control, the fear of the unknown, of what is beyond our ability to protect ourselves, the fear of being observed, of being the target of something we do not understand, something that moves in the shadows of the network. In this world of infinite connections, each of us is within reach of a stranger. Who was behind all this? What did he want? What is certain is that, try as I might, I will never be able to shake that feeling of being watched. And that, I think, is the greatest threat of all, never knowing if we are really safe, if what we share with the world is nothing more than an invitation to enter our intimacy, to violate us without us even noticing it. The mountain was covered by a blanket of dense fog, as if the world had vanished behind it. When I started the ascent, the sky was clear and the sunlight reflected on the snow with blinding intensity, but that was only a distant memory. Now, as the snowstorm raged furiously, all I could see was an icy, violent darkness. It wasn't just the weather that made me nervous. There was something much more unsettling lurking in the shadows. I am Santiago, an experienced mountaineer. I have been to many mountains. I have climbed peaks that few dare to touch, but I never imagined that one of my last expeditions would end up being a desperate fight for my life. I had hired a couple of local guides, men who knew the mountain like the back of their hand. They had promised a smooth crossing, a clear route, but as I progressed, each step became more uncertain, more dangerous, more strange. The trip started well. The first day's ascent was like any other. The snow crunched under our boots, the cold air was invigorating, and the guides, Mario and Javier, seemed to be reliable, self-assured, as experienced as I was. However, something in their demeanor began to change after the second day. At first, it was just a small detail. Mario, the younger of the two, began to constantly look back, as if he felt someone was following him. I, in my eagerness to keep up, ignored him. But when the storm started, everything changed. The snow raged with such force that we were forced to take refuge in a small, isolated cave, surrounded by cliffs and impossible drops. There, the wind pounded the rocks, echoing through the cave passages as if the very spirit of the mountain was rising up against us. Hours passed, and as time stood still, I realized that Mario and Javier were no longer talking to each other as before. Something in their silence made me uneasy, something I could not identify. As the storm raged furiously, my thoughts grew darker. Despite the storm, my mind couldn't stop thinking about the signs I had begun to notice. Why did those two men seem so tense? Why did Javier keep looking toward the edge of the cave, as if he was waiting for someone or something to appear? There was something that didn't fit. During the night, I woke up several times, unable to fall asleep. Through the small hole in the cave, I could see the storm raging outside, and although the shelter was relatively safe, I couldn't help but feel a growing discomfort. The feeling of being watched came over me. But it wasn't just that made me uneasy. Something was wrong with the attitude of the guides. The next morning, the storm did not abate. The wind howled with inhuman force, and the snow continued to fall through the crevasses, covering everything with an even thicker layer. We decided to continue the ascent, but as we advanced, the situation worsened. The mountain, which once seemed to have a serene beauty, had turned into a desolate and terrifying monster. The crags seemed to close in on us, and every step we took on the crunching snow was like a sentence, a doom that drew nearer and nearer. At that point, the real anguish began. The guides began to deviate from the usual path, the one they had shown me at the beginning. We were no longer going up the safer routes. They were leading me to more dangerous routes, to cliffs where the fall was lethal. The terrain was becoming more and more unpredictable, but the worst thing was not the weather or the conditions. The worst thing was the feeling that it was all intentional. I looked at Mario, who was moving forward, and saw him turn back, watching me with a smile that wasn't a smile. It was a forced smile, loaded with something I couldn't identify at first, but after a while I understood. I didn't want to be there. I didn't want his eyes to follow me. However, my survival instinct compelled me to move on. I couldn't stay behind. And I also couldn't ignore the feeling that was completely overtaking me. I was in danger. That night, when we finally decided to take a break to rest, the atmosphere was oppressive. The storm was raging more fiercely, but I could no longer help it. Something was very wrong. The guides were no longer talking to each other. Each of them was focused on his own thoughts. From a distance, I could see Javier staring at the map, but his hands were shaking in a way that seemed unnatural. From time to time, he would glance toward the edge of the road, as if waiting for something or someone to appear. Finally, that feeling became clear in my mind. There was something on the mountain, something in the air that I could not understand. The guides were not there to help me get to the top. They were in the wrong place, with the wrong people. The night was long, endless. I listened to their irregular breathing, their furtive movements. I was no longer sure if the danger came from the weather or from the men who shared the same mountain as me. And then, as if the mountain itself had decided to act, the storm lashed out with all its power. The snow was falling unstoppably, and the wind seemed intent on blowing us off the face of the earth. I decided to take control. I knew that if I didn't do something, I would not survive. While the guides were distracted, looking at the map or seeking shelter, I began to move silently. I grabbed my gear, my tools, and began to make an alternate route by which I could get out of there without being seen. The mountain opened up before me, but it wasn't a shelter. It was a threat waiting to trap me. I had no idea what might be happening, but it was clear that I had to escape. With each step, the storm intensified, the shadows lengthened, and my breathing became more erratic. Fear mixed with adrenaline as I moved forward, leaving the guides behind, losing them in the storm. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. The only certainty I had was that I had to get to the base, to get out of that hell before it was too late. I didn't know if the guides were following me or if there was no one behind me. The snow and the wind seemed to erase any trace. I was alone, all alone, on a mountain that no longer felt like a natural place. It was a monster, and I was its prey. Finally, after what seemed like hours, I managed to find a makeshift shelter in a crevice between two large rocks. I was exhausted, almost on the verge of hypothermia, but the most terrifying thing was the feeling that haunted me. I was not alone. I was being watched, stalked. The storm finally subsided, and at dawn, as the snow began to subside, I managed to descend to a safer shelter. I did not see the guides again. No one asked me what had happened. The mountain kept its secret, as it always does. Today, when I think about what happened, I cannot help but reflect on human nature. Sometimes the danger is not in the external forces, but in those that hide within those we trust. The mountain, with its imposing beauty, can be the refuge of a much greater nightmare. And sometimes the real monsters are not the ones we see, but the ones that surround us silently, waiting for the right moment to show their true face. At the top, I realized something fundamental. We cannot always trust those who accompany us. Sometimes the greatest danger lies in the heart of the human being, hidden under layers of appearances, ready to destroy what we love the most to achieve their own ends. And that lesson, that revelation, was the real terror. The rain did not stop. It pounded furiously against the broken windows of the asylum, making such a deafening noise that I found it hard to concentrate. I was sitting on the floor, in what once must have been a common room. The echoes of my breathing echoed in the frigid air that filled the rooms. The cold was unbearable. I hugged myself, trying to get warm, but warmth was a distant memory, something I could no longer feel. I didn't remember how I got there. I didn't know if it had been an accident or if someone had brought me. But what I did know was that the place was empty. That's what I thought, at least. Reality, however, is much harder to hold when the boundaries between what you see and what you feel begin to blur. My name is Samuel, and while I had no idea how I had ended up in that place, I did know that what I was experiencing was not a common occurrence. The asylum was in ruins, the walls covered in moss and damp, the corridors empty and dark. At times, the sound of my own footsteps was all I could hear, but there were times when, in the distance, something made me think I was not alone. The first few hours were quiet, walking from room to room, opening creaking doors, exploring those crumbling rooms. It seemed like what one would do in an old abandoned building, but it wasn't. Something didn't fit. Something in the air, in the pressure of the atmosphere, made every step I took leave me feeling claustrophobic, as if I were being watched by something I couldn't see. The place was a maze of endless corridors. All the ceilings were collapsed somewhere, and the walls were permeated with a strange smell of mold and rotting wood. I could find no signs of life. but I couldn't help feeling that I was being followed. Every time I stopped to listen, the sound of the storm outside faded, and only silence remained, dense, palpable. But after a while, something in that silence made me turn my head. Something was moving. Something I could not identify. On the first day, the fear was barely hinted at, but as time went on, the reality began to become murkier. I heard footsteps, but not my own. Occasionally, as I turned a corner or peeked my head around a door, I would see them. Shadowy figures, dressed in dark clothing, moving in the distance. They always disappeared before I could get close, but I could see them. And worst of all, they didn't look human. Or at least, they weren't in the way I understood them to be. Their walk was almost stealthy, as if they were part of the darkness itself, something that dissolved on contact with the light. They did not know I was watching them, and at first I felt sure they had not detected me. However, I was wrong. The second night was when everything began to fall apart. The storm raged even stronger. The wind howled through the cracks in the building, and the darkness grew thicker. I was sitting, watching the shadows dance on the walls, when I heard a whisper. It was soft, almost imperceptible, like a cold breeze between the cracks of the broken window. But there was no wind. Not inside that room. I stood up abruptly and hurried to the door, with the feeling that something was watching me from the darkest corner of the hallway. When I came out, I saw it clearly. A figure, barely visible, with a white mask covering his entire face. He was at the end of the corridor, motionless, as if waiting for me. I could not move. Fear paralyzed me, and my mind began to doubt what I was seeing. It was a hallucination, I thought. The fatigue, the isolation, the storm. It was all building up in my head, creating phantoms where there was nothing. But the figure didn't disappear. In fact, when I blinked and looked again, the masked man had moved a step closer, then another, and then another. Panic took hold of me. I started running, not thinking, not knowing where I was going. The masked man's footsteps echoed in the distance, a dull, steady sound that chased me through the asylum. I felt the pressure in my chest, my breathing agitated, the echo of my own fears. The shadows seemed to lengthen, as if they wanted to trap me, to envelop me. The endless corridors made me lose track of direction, and for every corner I turned, I encountered more empty corridors, more closed doors, and more figures hidden in the gloom. I could not escape. Suddenly, I stopped in front of a rusty iron door. I had seen it before, but I had not opened it. I didn't understand why I did, but I did. I pushed the door open with a creepy creak. I walked into what appeared to be a small storage room. The room was dark, but I could make out some broken shelves and dust-covered furniture. My mind was frantic, searching for a way out, a way to escape. It was then that I saw something on the floor, something that was partially covered by a torn blanket. I moved closer, unable to avoid curiosity, and upon discovering it, my stomach cringed. It was a mask, just like the one worn by the man who was chasing me. My heart pounded in my chest. I looked around, but there was no sign of anyone. Anguish gnawed at me. Panic rose in my throat. Something was not right. Something was very wrong. I tried to calm down. I couldn't just stand there. I couldn't stand still, doing nothing. I ran towards a broken window, but just as I was about to jump out, I saw a shadow appear in the hallway. Then another, and another, and another. My whole body was shaking. I was surrounded. There was no way out. For what seemed like hours, I ran aimlessly, passing through halls and corridors, always with that feeling that someone was stalking me in the dark. Every time I thought I had found a way out, I was met again with more closed doors, more figures watching me from the shadows. I was trapped in an endless circle, and fear took over my mind, overflowing all traces of logic. In the end, I don't know how I managed to escape. I only know that when I finally saw the front door of the asylum, it was too late. The storm had ceased, but what had been left in its place was far worse. The feeling that something else was there, waiting for me. The masked figure, with its impassive face, watching me from the shadows, always close, always vigilant. When I finally left the asylum, I realized something I could no longer ignore. The real danger was not the storm, nor the madness that seemed to take me over. The real terror was that, even after all that, I couldn't stop thinking about the shadows watching me from inside. Had I really escaped? Or was I just another piece in a game I didn't understand? The asylum no longer existed for me. But the masks never came off. The worst thing about fear is that it's not always about what you see, but what you can't understand. In that abandoned asylum, the figures that haunted me were nothing more than a reflection of what lurks in our own minds. The shadows of our doubts, our fears, our inability to control what surrounds us. The greatest threat is not always the visible enemy, but the invisible one. And perhaps we never really escape what we fear. Sometimes, the only thing we can do is to face the shadows inside us. My name is Javier. I live with the weight of what happened that night, a weight that has become more unbearable with each passing day. And although time has done its thing, I have learned that the scars of the soul do not fade with the passing of the years, but deepen. There is no place one can escape to from what one lived through. The past is always there, lurking, waiting for you to remember it. What happened began with something so simple, so everyday, that I didn't even pay attention at first. My daughter, Fernanda, had started using a new app. It was something that was all the rage, something that almost all of her friends were using. At first, I thought it was just another one of those fads, nothing I needed to worry too much about. But soon, I noticed something odd. The messages started out subtle, innocent even. At first, they were anonymous messages, simple questions, trivial comments. Then came the threats. There was no signature, no sender, just a strange number that didn't appear anywhere in our city. "You will donate one of your organs," said one of the first ones. "If you don't, you will pay the price." Fernanda was terrified, but she didn't tell me right away. She, like all teenagers, thought it was a joke, that someone was playing with her. But the threats escalated. "We know what you're doing. We're watching you." The tone changed. They were no longer just empty words. They were direct, as if someone was really close, as if they could see us. Despite my efforts to reassure her, Fernanda couldn't stop thinking about those messages. She disconnected the app, changed her number, blocked the contact. But what she didn't know, what none of us knew, is that evil never comes the way you expect it to. No matter how many locks you put on, no matter how many doors you close, evil always finds a crack to slip through. One night, around 3 a.m, my phone rang. The screen lit up the room in complete darkness. It was a text message from Fernanda, which made me jump out of bed instantly. But it wasn't just any message. The text just mentioned, "There is an individual in front of the entrance." My heart stopped. My mind started racing, remembering all those threats we had ignored. I ran toward Fernanda's room without a second thought, my breathing erratic. The house was silent, the air was heavy, and the rain was pounding hard on the windows, as if it wanted to break them. I found nothing at first. But then, I saw the reflection of something in the hallway window, the figure of a man, standing, waiting in the doorway. At that moment, my body tensed, adrenaline flooded my system. We didn't know what to do, or what to think. I tried to calm down, but my instinct told me something was terribly wrong. I decided to go to the door. It didn't matter anymore if I exposed myself. I needed to know who was there, why he had come to our house. My mind began to work in slow motion, analyzing every movement, every noise. Opening the door, I saw no one. Then suddenly there was a thud. The door was pushed with such force that we fell backwards. A man appeared out of nowhere, with a face covered by a mask, and in his hands, something shiny, a knife. Somehow, I could not scream, nor defend myself. The adrenaline was gone, and in its place, Only a feeling of paralysis remained. The man dragged us out, without a word, as if we were nothing more than objects. I tried to struggle, but it was useless. I don't know how, but we ended up in his car, miles away, in the shadows of the night and the rain that never stopped. I distinctly remember the sound of the rain hitting the roof of the car. Humidity permeated the air, and everything was deathly silent. We were trapped with no escape, unable to do anything to change our destiny. Every turn, every street we passed, seemed to take us further away from any hope. The man didn't say a word. He just drove, and we, terrified, stared out the window, trying to understand what was going on. Finally, we came to an isolated house, lost in the fog and storm. It was the kind of place you never expect to find in real life. It looked uninhabited, crumbling, as if it had been there for centuries. As we entered, all I saw was darkness, shadows moving with every flash of lightning that illuminated the place. We were led into a small, cold, dank room. The smell was unbearable, and the walls seemed to whisper horror stories. The man never spoke, but in that place I understood something with horror. We were not the first. The process was like a distorted dream. Without explanation, without warning, they took away one of Fernanda's organs. To me, something less obvious, but equally cruel: my right eye. We were bleeding to death in silence, and though my mind struggled to cling to reality, we already knew what we had lost. What had been taken from us? What terrified me most was not the physical pain. It wasn't what we had suffered. Worst of all was the feeling of helplessness, the feeling that everything we had done in our lives, all our decisions, were worthless in the face of the unstoppable machine of human horror. We had become just another piece in a macabre game, a conspiracy of those who see the suffering of others as a commodity to be sold. When they finally found us, it was too late to go back to being who we were. The police were late, as always. When they found us, Fernanda and I were no longer the same people. We had changed, not just physically, but in something much deeper. The trust, the peace, everything was gone. Today, when I look in the mirror, I see a different man. I see a father who could not protect his daughter, who could do nothing in the face of a monster who walked among us with the mask of normality. The days that followed were a blur. They tried to explain everything to us, but what we really needed were not words, but a way to forget, a way to rebuild what we had lost. Time has passed, but the feeling doesn't go away. The rain never stops. The wind keeps blowing, and although everything seems to have returned to normal, something inside me knows that danger is closer than we think. People are not always who they say they are, and worst of all, sometimes the threat comes from those you least expect. What I learned the hard way is that trust is a dangerous luxury. Sometimes evil doesn't come with a warning or a big bang. It comes quietly, like rain, and settles into your life before you know it. And by the time you realize it, it's too late to escape. You never know how much you can lose until there is nothing left but scars and shadows. And in the darkness, the traces of the past always come back. My name is Andres. If you know me, you'd probably think I'm a quiet person, one of those who prefer a good book or a walk in the park to a hectic night on the town. Routine, for me, was a refuge, a simple life with my wife, Laura, and my mother, Carmela. We had returned from a vacation on the coast, happy and relaxed, our minds full of pleasant memories, and our bodies still marked by the summer sun. We were returning home by a back road, seeking to shorten the journey and avoid heavy traffic. It was not a known route for us, but we trusted the GPS and the promise of a shortcut. It was a cloudy afternoon, and the rain began to fall softly, almost gently, as if the sky was trying to bid us farewell to our vacation. The air was cool, and the road stretched out in front of us, lined with trees that swayed gently in the wind. Everything seemed normal, until something changed. A few meters ahead, a group of men appeared on the road, interrupting the serenity of the landscape. At first, we thought it was a routine stop, a roadblock or something like that, but we quickly realized we were wrong. A couple of them advanced towards our car, pointing their hands at us, asking us to stop. My heart began to beat faster, but I still didn't understand what was happening. I thought maybe they wanted to steal our vehicle, and in a moment of foolishness, I tried to ignore them. But I couldn't. The sound of a gun being drawn broke the stillness of the afternoon, and fear gripped me in an instant. We were ordered out of the car. There was no shouting, no explanations. They just looked at us, those men, with a coldness that froze me completely. The three of us were so paralyzed that, although our minds were racing at 1,000 per hour, our bodies did not respond. Finally, Laura and my mother, their faces pale and their eyes full of fear, followed my example, reluctantly getting out of the car. We were pushed to the side of the road, surrounded by 3 armed men, without us being able to say a word. What we thought would be a simple robbery, something solved with a couple of bills, or the handing over of the car, quickly turned into a nightmare. We were loaded into a vehicle and started down a road where, with every kilometer, we were moving further away from the safety we had known. The rain was falling harder, now furiously, as if the sky itself was crying for us. There was no way of knowing where we were going. Everything was dark, the road empty, and the sound of the engine seemed to swallow any attempt at conversation, any logical thought. It was 12 hours that stretched on like years. During all that time, we didn't know what they wanted from us. We were kept in a secluded place, an old building that looked uninhabited, with broken windows and gray walls. The men who held us prisoner didn't say much, and their faces remained covered, as if all this was just another job, just another routine for them. However, something in their eyes told us that this was not the case. We were in the hands of human beings stripped of any humanity, people who, without thinking, could take away everything we had. There were moments when I felt like I was going to faint, where fear consumed me so much that I could not even breathe. I felt the gaze of those men on us, watching us every move, as if we were being measured, waiting for the right moment to make us understand how vulnerable we were. Everything was getting darker. Anxiety like a virus was taking over my mind, and there was no way to escape. At every instant, we were being beaten, pushed, bullied. We were nothing more than a simple exchange. They wanted money, an exorbitant sum that at first did not seem possible. But even so, we understood that our only option was to wait for someone else to get it. The storm outside those dirty walls only added to the tense atmosphere that enveloped us. The rain continued its unstoppable fall, as if the whole world agreed that we had no place at that moment. The fear of the unknown was the most terrifying thing. The silence in which we were kept was even worse than the blows or threats. The wait was an eternity. My mind, like a distorted movie, replayed over and over again the same scenes, the same thoughts. Memories of my former life, of happy moments with Laura and my mother, slowly faded away, as if they had never existed. Finally, after endless hours of anguish, a phone rang. A call that gave us back hope. My family had raised the amount the men were asking for. At first, I couldn't believe it. I thought it was another trick, another attempt to keep us in that place even longer. But when the money was delivered, the men let us go. They pushed us towards the road and left, without even looking at us. We left that place, our legs trembling and our hearts still racing, unable to believe what we had experienced. The rain, which had accompanied us before in our anguish, seemed calmer now, but the nightmare remained engraved in our minds, like a distant but constant echo. We were no longer the same people who had climbed into that car hours before. Something had broken inside us, and there was no turning back. We returned home, but not to the life we knew. Every corner of the house seemed strange to us. Every sound, every door closing, reminded us of what we had lost, what we could never get back. It was not the money that stripped us, nor the physical pain that marked us the most. What really changed in us was the sense of vulnerability, the knowledge that, in the blink of an eye, everything could fall apart, Today, I look at my mother and Laura, and although we try to move forward, I know that something inside us is broken. The fear no longer goes away, and the faces of those men are still present in my nightmares. We can never forget what happened in those 12 hours. What they did to us was cruel, but what the experience left us with is even worse. The feeling that security, the one you think you have, is as fragile as glass. What I learned is that life does not always let you know when it is going to change. You may think that everything is under control, that you are safe, until you realize that danger is closer than you think. Sometimes, the worst enemy is not what comes from outside, but what makes you feel that there is no more refuge, no more escape. Fear does not go away with time. It does not dissipate with the sun. Fear remains, hidden in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to come out. And when it does, everything changes. All I can do now is wait, knowing that life goes on, but never forgetting what happened. Because in the end, the hardest lesson is that what defines you is not what happens to you, but how it changes you. I never knew that a single detour could change everything. It all started like any other night, after a long day of work. Tiredness was pushing me to look for a break, and the idea of a brief stop at the bar we used to frequent seemed like the perfect plan. It was a small, unpretentious place, with few people and a quiet atmosphere. Ideal to leave the routine behind, to relax and share a beer with my friends. In that corner of the world, we forgot about responsibilities, expectations, and problems. We just enjoyed the moment. At least that's what we thought. It was one of those nights when everything seemed to fall into place. We settled at our usual table, near the window, from where we could see the traffic passing by unhurriedly, as if the world outside the bar was still spinning while we took refuge in our little bubble. As usual, we started talking about everyday things: work, personal projects, the ups and downs of our love lives. The jokes flowed, memories of old stories slipped naturally between us, and the sound of soft music in the background enveloped us in a sense of comfort. However, as often happens in the best stories, there was a small twist, one that was almost imperceptible at first. It wasn't a drastic change. There were no clear signs of what was to come, but that night something felt different from the moment they walked in. A group of men, 3 or 4, were no more than figures at first, but something about their presence caught our attention. It wasn't the clothing or the attitude of those guys that alarmed us, but an inexplicable energy they brought with them. We didn't talk about it too much, but we all sensed that there was something strange about the way they were behaving. It was as if they weren't there just for the sake of drinking, as if their presence had a darker, more sinister purpose. One of those men, the one who seemed to be the leader of the group, had a piercing gaze. It was not a casual gaze, like that of anyone simply observing their surroundings, but a gaze that swept through every corner of the bar with an unsettling intensity. I'm not one to be swayed by first impressions, but something about that look left me with an uneasy feeling, as if he knew something we did not. However, my friends and I decided to ignore it. After all, we were a group of people just looking to relax, and we preferred not to think about the strangers in the room. The hours passed relatively normally, laughter continued to flow, and drinks were passed from hand to hand. But the atmosphere began to become strangely charged. I couldn't tell exactly what had changed, only that something wasn't right. The presence of these men, which until then had been just a marginal detail, was beginning to take up more space in the room. There was an underlying tension that we didn't know how to explain, but that we all felt. The situation suddenly boiled over when Javier, the most extroverted of us, made a joke about the weekend soccer game. The conversation was flowing smoothly, until one of the men in the group, the one who until that moment had remained silent, turned to our table. His gaze was fixed on Javier, and for an instant, all of us at the table fell silent, aware that something didn't fit. It wasn't just the look. There was something in the air that made us feel as if we had crossed an invisible line, something we had never perceived before. But we didn't say anything. We kept drinking, thinking maybe we were just being paranoid. What happened next was like a split second that stretched on for an eternity. The man got up from his seat with an unsettling calmness and walked to the bar. I couldn't hear what he said to the bartender, but something about the way he did it struck me as odd. It was as if he was giving an order, not making a request. His voice was low, his movements slow and controlled, but the surroundings had changed completely. The murmurs of conversation faded away, as if the noises of the outside world had ceased to exist for a moment. An hour passed, and for a brief moment it seemed that everything was back to normal. We laughed at some anecdote and were preparing to leave, when suddenly, one of those men approached our table. It was not the same man who had been watching Javier before. It was another one who had been quiet all the time, but somehow now seemed the center of attention. His presence, which had been subdued before, was now overwhelming. When he reached us, the noise of the bar, the voices, the music, everything faded away completely. Only he was left. At that moment, I realized that we were no longer in the same place. The atmosphere had become heavy, charged with a palpable tension that could not be ignored. Javier, as always, tried to break the ice with a joke, but something in the air stopped him. There were no answers. The man did not say a word. His gaze, fixed on Javier, was implacable, as if he was waiting for something none of us understood. Chaos exploded in the blink of an eye. The argument between the other men in the group began, but it wasn't words that alerted us. It was the energy of the fight. Like a spark that ignited an explosion, everything went out of control. Tables flew, glasses shattered, and screams mingled with the sound of glass crashing to the floor. Chaos ensued with chilling speed. No one knew what was happening. The men were hitting each other with uncontrollable fury, and we, caught in the middle of that whirlwind, were trying to separate them, but it was impossible. It took minutes for the police to arrive, but those minutes seemed like an eternity. In that time, everything that once seemed safe and familiar turned into a spiral of despair. Every movement, every scream, every blow was part of a puzzle we never imagined we would form. The violence was not only physical, it was something deeper, something that touched a sensitive spot in the soul of each of us, something bigger than the fists, the broken glass, and the marks on the skin. It was fear, the feeling of being trapped in something we could not understand. When the men finally left, they left behind a destroyed bar and a group of unrecognizable friends. Javier was wounded, but not only physically. The scar on his face was the least of his worries. What was reflected in his eyes was something much more terrifying. Fear. The fear that invaded us all. Something in our essence was broken that night. Something we could never repair again. The city was still the same, but we no longer saw it the same. The sense of security, the confidence in the daily routine, all of that crumbled. The most terrifying thing was not the violence, not the physical harm, not even the screams that echoed in our minds for days. The scariest thing was the realization of how fragile we are, how easy it is to lose control, how easily we can fall victim to chaos we don't understand. And most frightening of all, after that night, we would never be the same again. The darkness does not always come in an obvious way. Sometimes it hides in the details, in what we don't see. And the hardest lesson we learned that night was that you never know when something as insignificant as an outing to a bar can change our lives forever. That night, the rain didn't stop. It pounded on the car windows with such force that it felt like the whole world was about to fall apart. The street lights, blurred and scattered, were reflected in the water that accumulated on the pavement, creating a blurred landscape like a liquid nightmare. Paula had insisted on going to a bigger bar, with more people, with more noise, but I wasn't in the mood for that. I prefer quiet places, where you can talk, relax, and not be surrounded by crowds. So, after briefly discussing the subject, we ended up in a familiar bar, in a quiet corner of town. The music was soft, the lights dim, and the conversation flowed smoothly. My friends, Paola and I had a couple of beers and talked about trivial things, as usual. Sometimes I wonder if those little things aren't the ones that really keep us connected, as if the simplest moments are the most worthwhile. Hours passed without anything special happening. The night progressed, and by about 3 a.m., we decided it was time to leave. Paola wanted me to drop her off at her house, so I accompanied her while my friends stayed a while longer. The rain had increased in intensity, and the sound of the drops hitting the roof of the car almost lulled me to sleep. I dropped Paola off in front of her building and kissed her goodbye quickly, as usual, without thinking anything out of the ordinary. The drive home was what it had always been. An empty street, the city lights blurred in the distance, the feeling of being alone in the world. At that hour of dawn, the city seemed to be at a standstill, as if everyone had retired to their homes to wait for the sunrise. There was nothing strange in the atmosphere, nothing that made me think that something might be about to change. Suddenly, however, I began to feel a slight discomfort. I wasn't sure what was causing it. Maybe it was just the darkness of the night or the accumulated tiredness, but a strange sensation began to invade my body, as if someone was watching me. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw something that chilled my blood. 2 figures walking quickly along the sidewalk, right behind my car. At first, I didn't think anything of it. Maybe they were going home. Maybe they were simply walking in the rain. However, as they passed a couple of lights, I realized that their footsteps matched mine. It was not a chance coincidence. I sped up a bit and watched again. They did not change their pace. I kept driving, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As I drove down the street, I kept looking in the rearview mirror. The men were still there, always at the same distance. My heart began to pound harder, and a restlessness that I didn't know how to handle took hold of me. I couldn't see their faces clearly because of the rain, but something in their movements made me think they weren't just passers-by. They didn't turn away. They didn't walk away. They were steady, as if they were waiting for me. At first I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was just paranoid. Who wouldn't feel uncomfortable on a rainy night, alone on the street, with that feeling of being watched? But that idea soon crumbled when, as I turned a corner, I saw that they had also turned behind me. The discomfort turned into something else, an alarm, a primal instinct that told me something wasn't right. I sped up a little more nervously now, but they kept up the same pace. They didn't speed up, but they didn't slow down either. They were there, always close, but never so close that I could see their faces. The rain didn't stop, but somehow it seemed to intensify, creating a noise that muffled all other sounds. I could only hear the engine of my car and the constant pattering of the drops against the glass. I felt trapped in a circle, as if I were part of something I couldn't escape. I decided to make a sharp turn, take a side street. I thought that if I changed direction, I might lose them. I turned and accelerated even more, constantly looking in the rearview mirror. I was convinced they wouldn't follow me, but when I looked again, I saw they were still there, a little closer this time. I could no longer ignore them. There was something in the way they moved, something in their attitude that told me they were not just people strolling around town. Fear began to settle in my chest. I felt vulnerable, exposed. My mind was racing a mile a minute, trying to find a logical explanation for what was happening, but I couldn't think of anything that made sense. The feeling of being chased was tangible, like a weight on my shoulders. I sped up even more, but it didn't seem to matter. They were still there, unhurriedly, but without pause. At that moment, a terrifying thought crossed my mind. What if they weren't following me by chance? What if all this wasn't an accident but something else? I couldn't stop to think about that. I couldn't allow myself to panic. Instinct told me I should do something, but what? Scream? Stop and confront them? Neither option seemed safe. My body was tense, muscles rigid, as if I was prepared for a fight I didn't know would happen or not. I kept driving through the streets, making turns, trying to lose them. But every time I looked back, they were still there. So close, but never close enough to see their faces. I was losing control of the situation, and that was what terrified me the most. It wasn't about the possibility that they were dangerous. It was about the feeling that something was out of place, that the fate of that night was no longer in my hands. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, I saw the street that led to my house. I decided to take a chance, confident that at least I would be safer there. I turned right quickly, accelerating to get there as quickly as possible. Looking in the rearview mirror, I saw them again. They were closer, but not so close that I could make out their faces. At that moment, I made a decision. I accelerated to the maximum, without looking back, without thinking. I just wanted to get home, get inside, and feel that I was safe. I made it home. I parked the car quickly and ran to the door. My hands were shaking, my heart was pounding in my chest, and an inexplicable sense of dread enveloped me. I closed the door behind me with a dull thud and stood in the hallway, breathing heavily. I looked out the window, hoping to see something in the darkness of the street, something to confirm that it had all been just my imagination. But I saw nothing. The street was empty, as always, silent, as if nothing had happened. That night, the fear did not disappear with the dawn. In fact, what disturbed me most was the realization that, although I never saw those men again, something in me had changed forever. From that night on, the city no longer felt so safe. The outside world seemed more hostile, more unpredictable, and the feeling of being vulnerable, of being exposed to the unknown, never completely left me. Today, looking back, I realized that the real lesson of that night was not the chase itself, nor the possibility of being in danger. The real lesson was to understand how fragile is the sense of security that surrounds us. We live our lives as if everything is under control, as if nothing can interrupt our routine. But all it takes is a simple twist, a small deviation in our path, for everything to collapse. Sometimes the greatest threat is not in what we can see, but in what we do not understand, in what remains hidden in the shadows. We don't need monsters or ghosts. The real darkness lies in the human, in the capacity of others to become unpredictable, to put us in danger without warning. And the scariest thing of all is that, when that line is crossed, we are no longer the same. That night the rain was falling with such fury that it seemed to want to sweep everything away. The drops hit the windshield of the car with force, as if the sky itself was trying to remind me of something important, something I had forgotten. Visibility was almost zero, and although the traffic was light, the atmosphere was charged, tense. Every time the windshield wiper passed from one side to the other, I saw how the lights of the cars on the streets reflected on the accumulated water, creating strange shadows. At first, I thought it was just the weather, but in the back of my mind, something was telling me it wasn't. I had spent the last few months caught up in the maelstrom of my work. I was a successful entrepreneur, one of those guys who believed that nothing could go wrong. The company was my life, my legacy, and everything about it seemed to work perfectly. However, that night I was realizing that all was not as well as I thought. Something had upset the balance, something I couldn't identify until it was too late. It all started with a call, a message from someone I wasn't expecting. An old friend from college, Roberto, who had been out of the business for years but kept in touch on occasion. His voice that night was low, almost anguished, as if he had been keeping something very important under control and finally couldn't anymore. He spoke of something going on in the market, of certain maneuvers behind the curtains, and although he tried to play it down, something in his tone made it clear to me that he was in danger. He told me that I should be alert, that there was something about to happen that would change everything. That same night, As I was returning home after a long day of meetings, my mind kept turning Roberto's words over in my head. I thought maybe it was paranoia, a simple market maneuver, but I couldn't help but feel a growing tightness in my chest. Something in his voice, something I couldn't identify, told me I had to pay attention. Maybe he was used to ignoring the signals. Maybe I thought that, with money and power, nothing could bring me down. By the time I got home, my thoughts were already clouded. The rain was pounding on the window pane loudly, a sound I barely heard as my fingers scrolled across my computer keyboard, reviewing documents that seemed to have no end. But something had changed in my focus. The numbers didn't make the same sense. The strategies I had created, the alliances I had forged, everything was beginning to feel like a house of cards. The restlessness continued to grow, and it was then that I decided to go out for a moment for a walk. The rain did not stop, and the feeling of uneasiness increased with every minute. I drove through lonely, almost empty streets, where the traffic lights seemed dimmer than ever. My mind wandered between one concern and another, but my sense of alertness continued to increase. Every time a car passed by me, it seemed to me that something strange was moving inside. Something that couldn't be seen, but I could feel it. That's when I saw them. A couple of cars that, at first, appeared to be simply part of the traffic. But something didn't add up. First there was a flash, a reflection in the rearview mirror. Then the sound of tires picking up speed. The first car passed and vanished in the rain. But the second one began to follow me. At first I thought it was a fluke. They might have thought I was just another aimless driver. But the car began to keep a steady distance, following me at a speed that matched my own. I decided to make a sudden turn, taking a side street. Maybe if I drove away, this would all just be paranoia. But as I rounded the bend, I saw that the car hadn't disappeared. It was still there, off in the distance, headlights on. I felt a cold sweat run down my back. Every red light became an obstacle, a reminder that I couldn't escape easily. I sped up, thinking maybe I could lose him. But as I rounded more corners, the car was still there, always a safe distance away. At that moment, something in my mind began to click. I remembered what Roberto had told me, how he mentioned that in business, the competition was willing to do anything to destroy the others. But I never imagined they would go this far. Were they after me? Had something I had done put them in my way? The idea of a conspiracy began to take shape, but I didn't want to accept that things could be so serious. Instead of feeling protected in my car, the cabin closed, the rain beating on the glass, I felt it was a trap. I realized I couldn't keep driving around aimlessly. Every time I looked in the rearview mirror, the car was still there, as if they were waiting for the right moment. I made a decision. I accelerated full throttle, looking for the narrowest streets, the darkest ones. I needed to get out of that situation, to lose them somehow. But they knew what I was doing. Every turn I took, they followed with the same precision. The feeling that they not only followed me, but also knew me, chilled my blood. How did they know what I was going to do? How long had they been watching me? At some point, as I wandered the lonely streets of the city, I began to think about everything I had done to get there. My competitors, the alliances, the risky moves I'd made, the decisions I'd overlooked. I had believed that power and money kept me safe. But now I realized that all that had created more enemies than I could count. Finally, I came to a dead end. The car chasing me didn't stop. They accelerated until they reached the end of the street, where I was trapped. I could not turn around. I was surrounded, not by ghosts or monsters, but by something far more dangerous. Human beings, as ready to destroy everything as I had ever been. At that moment, the rain suddenly stopped. The silence was deafening. The feeling of being trapped, with no way out, crushed me. But something inside me didn't give up. I looked back at the car that had followed me, the windows fogged by the rain, the headlights blinding. The fear was palpable, but deep down I knew I couldn't let them drag me into that darkness. I had to do something, and I couldn't let my past decisions be the ones that defined me. Somehow, I managed to find a way out. I changed direction, like an animal escaping its predator. I ran, dodged, and accelerated with all my might until the city disappeared from my sight. I was no longer running from those cars alone. I was running from the life I had built, from the choices I had made that had led me there. But worst of all, what really scarred me that night was the realization that no matter how high you go, how strong you think you are, there will always be someone ready to knock you down. Today, even though life has gone on, something in me has changed forever. The traces of that night, the feeling of being vulnerable, are with me every day. Because deep down, what really terrifies me is not the power of others, not even the ability they have to destroy you. What really terrifies me is realizing how easy it is to fall into the trap, how fragile is the security we think we have. Life is nothing more than a set of choices, and the most important lesson I learned that night was that sometimes the simplest choices can generate repercussions, much more far-reaching than one might assume. Now, every time I look back, I realize something important. We are never as secure as we think we are. Confidence in what we have built can vanish in a second, and everything we have done can be undone by those who are willing to do anything to get what they want. Living at the top has its price, and that price is the constant uncertainty of not knowing who is watching, who is waiting for the exact moment to knock us down. The rain did not stop. It hit the glass with such intensity that the sound was almost deafening, as if the whole sky had decided to pour over the city. On the street, the drops formed rivulets that meandered along the asphalt, dragging leaves and debris, while the wind whipped hard, moving the branches of the trees as if they were trying to shed their last layer. I was driving along a deserted road, illuminated only by the flashing headlights of the car. In the distance, I could only see the fuzzy silhouette of buildings, the dim lights marking the city limits. Everything felt empty, distant. The tension in my chest was not new, but that night, as never before, it was more present, more unbearable. What had begun as a search for something greater, for something that would offer me purpose beyond the everyday things of life, had ended up being a descent into the abyss. Now, as I drove in the dark, my mind couldn't help but drift back to those dark days, to the time when, naive and lost, I decided to join that cult. The thought of it sent a shiver down my spine. I remembered how easy it had been to convince me. At first, the promise of something greater, of a truth that transcended everything I knew, seduced me. Immortality, freedom, power. That was what I was being offered. The first meeting had been in a small cafe on the outskirts of the city, a quiet place, almost forgotten by most. I wasn't looking for anything, just a way to disconnect, to leave behind the routine that was suffocating me. But that man, with his dark eyes and enigmatic smile, knew what I was looking for. From that moment on, I couldn't help myself. He invited me to a meeting, to an initiation, as they called it. They said it was all a purification rite, a necessary step to reach the next level of consciousness. Nothing out of the ordinary, nothing that would alert me. When I entered the church that first time, the doors closed behind me with a thud that still echoes in my ears. The atmosphere was dense, almost heavy, as if the air itself was permeated with an energy I did not understand. The lights were low, and the faces around me seemed to reflect something I could not identify. There was something in their eyes, something that made them different from anyone else I had ever met. It was as if they were living in a parallel reality, oblivious to the outside world. But I was drawn to it, and I let myself go. The first ritual was strange, innocent to my way of looking at it then, but there was something that didn't fit. The incense, the words in a language I didn't understand, the slow circle dances. It all seemed like part of a game to me. I thought that, if I decided to continue, I would soon understand the purpose behind it all. And at first, it all seemed to make sense. There was something in the air, a sense of power, of belonging to something bigger. I felt alive. I felt free, as if my life had taken on a purpose it didn't have before. But that didn't last long. As the days went by, situations began to transform. The cult leader, a man with a stern face and piercing gaze, began to talk more about purification and the need for sacrifices. At first, I thought he meant symbolic sacrifices, leaving behind old beliefs or ties that bound me to the outside world. But the reality was quite different. It was not about symbols. It wasn't about freeing my mind or my soul. It was about something much darker, something I never imagined. On the deepest nights, the rituals became more intense. It wasn't just about invoking higher energies or reaching for the truth. I soon realized that the true essence of the rituals was much more macabre. There was blood, human sacrifice, people disappearing in the middle of the ceremony. This was not what I had imagined, not what I had been promised. One night, after a particularly somber ritual, when everything was over and the church was silent, I came across something I had never anticipated, the true motives of the cult. I saw a person, someone I had spoken to several times, being led to the altar. It was not a simulation. It was not an act. She was being sacrificed for real. The horror I experienced at that moment was indescribable. I felt my body become paralyzed. I wanted to scream, to run away, to do something, but fear blocked me. I could only stand there, watching, motionless, while that person's life was extinguished. When I escaped, I did it without thinking, without a logical reason. I ran as I had never run before, without looking back. I didn't know what to do, or where to go. I just knew I had to get out of that place before it was too late. For days I was in shock, trying to understand what had happened, but the images of that night kept haunting me. However, I had no time to reflect. The chase had begun. I could not go to the police. They were too powerful, too influential. The cult did not spare those who escaped. I knew they were looking for me, that at any moment someone would show up at my door, and they wouldn't stop until they found me. That night, as I drove down the lonely road, I remembered everything I had left behind. The house I lived in, the life I had built, and all of it for what? That desperate search for something bigger, something better. But all he had found was darkness, the horror of what humans can be capable of in the name of illusory power. I watched the rearview mirrors constantly, hoping to see some silhouette following me, but I did not. The fear was still present, but the greater fear was knowing that, even if I escaped their hands, something had changed forever inside me. I was no longer the same person who had entered that cult. I was no longer the naive young man who thought he could control his destiny. The reality was much more complex, much more dangerous than I had imagined. When I finally reached the city, the sun was already beginning to rise, but the feeling of despair did not leave me. The sky, still gray from the rain, seemed an exact reflection of my mind. I knew there was no way to escape completely. I knew they were still nearby, waiting for the right moment to catch me. What I learned from that experience, and what I want you to understand, is that sometimes what appears to be a unique opportunity, a path to something better, is actually a trap. We human beings are capable of the worst atrocities when we get carried away by the promise of power, of immortality, of control. But what we fail to understand is that in that quest, the only thing we find is our own undoing. Today, I look at the world in a different way. The lights, the people, the promises of success and power no longer matter to me. The real strength lies in understanding our limitations, in realizing that sometimes what we want most can be what destroys us most. And that is something I will never forget. No matter how hard we try to escape our destiny, There are times when the only option is to face it and accept it. There is no such thing as immortality. The only certainty in existence is death. And the worst of all is that, sometimes, it is not death that scares us the most, but what we are willing to do to avoid it. The rain was unleashed that night. The sky looked like an angry giant, smashing everything in its path with thunder that rumbled as if the earth itself were shaking. The drops were furiously hitting the windshield of the car, almost dulling the sound of the engine. The road was empty, except for the reflections of lights gliding across the wet asphalt, like ghostly shadows. As I drove on, the sound of the storm enveloped me, filling my thoughts with an eerie sense that something was about to happen. I had spent a quiet, almost nondescript afternoon. I spent time with my 6-year-old daughter Valeria, playing in the garden as the storm prepared to unleash its fury on the city. The rain didn't seem important then. The afternoon passed in relative calm, with Valeria jumping in the puddles and me organizing a few things inside the house. It was a momentary peace, almost illusory. No one at that moment could imagine what would come next. When we entered the house, the darkness outside seemed to devour the edges of the lights. The storm had begun to hit harder, but I wasn't paying much attention to it. All seemed quiet until I heard the noise. A dull sound, like the front door creaking open. At first I thought it was the wind, or the house giving way to rain. But then I heard it again. Heavy footsteps, shuffling down the hallway. My instincts, always alert when it was my daughter, made me turn quickly. I saw him. A man. Tall, stocky, with a face I didn't recognize, but there was something in his gaze that made my blood run cold. He was soaked from the rain that had entered the house along with him, but his posture was firm, determined. He was no mere intruder. In his eyes I saw something much darker, something he was unwilling to ignore. His presence was charged with palpable tension. I didn't know what he wanted, but I imagined the worst. I saw Valeria, who had been playing in the living room, approaching the threshold, looking at the man blankly. Her confidence was immediately shattered. I saw her recoil, terrified, seeking shelter behind me. It was then that I knew I had to do something. My heart was pounding, but my mind was alert. If that man had walked through our door, I wasn't going to let him take what I loved most. I thought instinct was the only thing guiding me. This was no simple robbery. That man had come with a much more sinister purpose. Desperate, I ran to Valeria, grabbed her by the hand and pushed her into the hallway while trying to put myself between her and the stranger. I knew I couldn't let her get any closer. The rain was still pounding against the window furiously, but at that moment only the immediate danger lurking inside my house mattered. The man stepped forward toward us without speaking. His gaze was fixed on Valeria. I could see he had no fear, just a cold determination, empty of emotion, as if he already knew that nothing could stop him. Terror gripped me, but somehow, something inside me was awakened. I threw myself at him without thought, without fear. I thought of only one thing: saving my daughter. The fight was short, but savage. The house, once a refuge, became a prison full of echoes of blows, of muffled screams. The man did not fight in a disorganized manner. His aggressiveness was precise, as if every move was calculated. For a moment the floor became slippery, and the sound of our bodies crashing against walls and furniture was the only thing that could be heard above the roar of the storm. Suddenly the man stumbled and fell to the ground. Something in my mind changed in that instant, as if the world had stopped. The reflection of his gaze, of his expression full of fury, made me hesitate for a second, but that second was enough. My hands, trembling but firm, found an object on the floor. Without thinking, I picked it up and used it. The situation changed in the blink of an eye, and the man stood still. I can't say I understood it at the time, nor did I accept it. Fear was still throbbing in my chest, but something inside me snapped. I saw his body on the ground, motionless, and I knew there was no turning back. Valeria didn't understand what had happened. She was standing in the doorway, her eyes big and terrified, staring between terror and confusion. I couldn't tell her that everything would be all right, because I didn't know it myself. Without thinking, I took her by the hand and led her toward the garage. I knew the police would be there soon, and that I couldn't stay there, not with what I had done. My mind was beginning to crumble under the weight of guilt, but my feet kept moving, carrying me away from the scene I had just created. In the car, the sound of thunder enveloped me, but inside me all was silence. The wet, deserted road was now the only road left. I had no idea where I was going, only that I needed to get out. The rain, which seemed like a punishment, did not stop. The car was moving slowly, almost as if it too was feeling the pressure of what had just happened. My heart would not stop pounding. It wasn't just the fear of justice that terrified me. It was the knowledge that what I had done could not be undone. That shadow of what had happened would follow me no matter where I went. The city, slowly receding in the rearview mirror, no longer seemed the same to me. The familiar streets, the buildings that used to give me a sense of security, now seemed like a threat. Every headlight that crossed my view was a sign that something bigger was approaching. I didn't know what I would do next, or how long I could run from what had just happened. All I knew was that I had crossed a line, and worst of all, at that point, there was no turning back. The car continued to move forward, and as the storm raged on, I couldn't help but wonder, what becomes of a person when they make a decision like the one I had made? What happens when someone else's life is in your hands, and the only way to save your own is to destroy someone else's? The line between right and wrong disappears when survival is at stake. What happened that night was not just a physical confrontation. It was the realization that any human being, under the right circumstances, can become something that not even he himself will recognize. That night, I realized that the real threat doesn't always come from the outside. It is not monsters or ghosts that haunt us, but the choices we make. When faced with desperation, with the need to protect what we love most, fear can drive us to do things we never imagined possible. The greatest threat is not in the eyes of our enemies, but in our own. Because sometimes the biggest monster we face is within ourselves. We may never know if what we did was right, or if what we lost was right. But one thing is for sure, we cannot escape the choices we make, nor the shadows they leave behind. The night began with a dull rumbling, as if the sky was roaring for something we mortals couldn't understand. The rain pounded on the windows of my studio with unusual force, as if the world wanted to flood my mind. I was there, sitting in front of the canvas, surrounded by brushes and pigments, but my mind was not really there. I could not concentrate. Something had changed in the air. Something in my surroundings made me feel uncomfortable, as if I was being watched, as if everything I had created so far was being put to the test. I am an artist, or at least that's what I've always considered myself. My career has been successful, or so I am told. The exhibitions, the awards, the reviews, everything seemed to go according to plan. But lately, the calm I enjoyed before, that kind of isolation that art requires, had started to become unbearable. It wasn't just the pressure of expectations, but something more subtle, something lurking in the shadows, a sense of being pursued, watched, something creeping behind the curtain of my reality. And that feeling began to become tangible one autumn afternoon, when a letter arrived at my workshop. It was no ordinary letter. It was not signed by a collector or a gallery owner. It was just a white sheet of paper with meticulous calligraphy that formed words that felt too close, too personal. The message was simple. I have followed your work for years. Your paintings have touched me deeply. I'm not just your fan. I'm an extension of you. I want to show you what I can do. At first, I took it as common admiration, just another fan who was inspired by my paintings. Perhaps a somewhat overly passionate admirer, but nothing more. I quickly forgot about the letter, but the nagging noise in my mind did not. Something didn't fit. There was something in the tone of the words that left me uneasy. Such direct, intense obsession was uncommon in my past experiences. I had never had a fan so fervent. Weeks later, I saw his work for the first time. That painting, hanging in a gallery in a nearby city, was so identical to mine that I stopped to look at it for minutes, unable to move. The form, the technique, the composition, everything. It was as if I had painted that work without realizing it. But it was not mine. At first I thought it was a coincidence. It could be that the admirer, whoever she was, had simply been inspired by my style. But as I saw more of her paintings in galleries and art stores, the discomfort grew. The woman wasn't just imitating my work, she was replicating it with eerie precision. I tried to avoid her, to ignore her. If anyone asked her about her influences, she answered humbly, as if everything was the fruit of her own efforts. But her works were an exact copy of what I had done in recent years. I couldn't stop thinking about her. Her presence was everywhere, in galleries, in art forums, on social networks, where she shared her creations, always with that air of false modesty. One night, while walking around the city after an exhausting day in my studio, I saw her for the first time in person. She was standing in front of a gallery, looking at the display case. I approached cautiously, not wanting to be recognized, but when she looked up, our gazes met. A shiver ran down my spine. There was no fear in her eyes, only an inhuman intensity, as if we had known each other forever, as if everything in her soul had been tailor-made to fit my own reflection. Despite my desire to walk away, something compelled me to take a step toward her. The distance between us narrowed, but before I could do or say anything, she turned and disappeared into the darkness of the night. The last thing I saw was the silhouette of her slender figure fading into the rainy air. The next time I heard about her was in an article in an art magazine, one that detailed this woman's trajectory as the new sensation in the contemporary art world. In interviews, she talked about the importance of expressing the inexpressible, about capturing the soul on canvas. She said that her works were a portrait of the spirit of the artist who had inspired her. She never mentioned my name directly, but everyone knew who she was referring to. The line between admiration and appropriation had disappeared. She was stealing my identity. From that moment on, his presence began to become a nightmare. I would receive strange messages in my email, in which he would talk about the deep bond we shared, about how our souls were intertwined through art. Each message was accompanied by one of his works, an exact replica of a painting of mine, but with disturbing details added. Always the same, but slightly altered, distorted, as if she was trying to make me feel I wasn't seeing what I thought I was seeing. Then something changed. One day, while I was in my studio, someone knocked on the door. At first I thought it was a visitor or a collaborator, but when I opened the door, I found a wooden box. It had no return address, just a small note attached to the side. "It's time for us to come together, for you to recognize what I really am," the note said. I opened the box gingerly, and inside I found a work of art, a haunting portrait of my own face, painted with the exact same technique I used. But there was something different about the portrait's eyes, something I couldn't explain. I looked, and I saw myself. At that moment, everything in me began to fall apart. What did she want? What could I do? I knew I couldn't just ignore her, because in every corner of my life, in every canvas I painted, she was there, watching, retorting, lurking. Art, something that had always been my refuge, my only language, was now being corrupted, distorted by someone else's obsession. Desperate, I decided to confront it all. I followed the trail I had left, until I reached a remote house on the outskirts of the city. The storm had worsened that night, and the rain was pouring down, making the streets empty, lonely. The house was silent, with the lights off. I felt a weight in the air, something dense, as if the atmosphere itself was saturated with tension. Inside, everything was silent. But as I walked through the house, I saw what I never imagined. my artwork, all of it, hanging on the walls. Every single one of my paintings, replicated down to the smallest detail. But there were also my worst fears captured on canvas. Each painting was not only a copy, it was a reinterpretation of my own psyche, distorted and twisted, reflecting what I had hidden, what I didn't want to see. In the center of the room, she was there, standing, looking at one of my paintings. Her eyes never lifted for a moment from the painting, as if she was waiting for me to say something. The air was charged with something unbearable. I could feel my own breath catch in my chest. In that instant, I understood that it wasn't just admiration. It was a struggle to take my place, to be me, but without being me. I don't know how it all ended. I remember walking towards the door, feeling a part of me crumbling, but also a deeper part of me that had found a way to break free. All I know is that I never painted the same way again. I never saw art the same way again. The obsession that had begun as an admiration ended up being an echo of what could have been a catastrophe for my life, my identity, and my career. Sometimes obsessions are not born out of nowhere. They are not external forces coming from an unseen world. Obsessions are born out of human frailty, out of the need to control, to be recognized, to be seen. They surround us, stalk us, imitate us. The line between admiration and possession slowly dissolves until we no longer know if we are who we think we are. What happened to me was not only a theft of my art, it was a theft of my essence, of what I represent as a person. The greatest threat is not in others, but in the power we give to what defines us. And sometimes, the art that defines us can be the same that destroys us.